I saw my husband slip the white powder into my seafood gumbo through the reflection of the polished silver serving tray. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack my chest open. But I did not scream. I did not jump up or knock the bowl to the floor. Instead, I waited for the perfect distraction, swapped my bowl with my mother-in-law, and started a silent 5-minute countdown in my head. My name is Charmaine, 35 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer and forensic accountant, I had spent years building an empire they could only dream of. I escaped their toxicity early on, but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they insisted on a traditional family dinner to catch up. Between the cornbread and the sweet tea, my mother-in-law leaned forward smirking. "You know, Charmaine, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way." I simply sipped my water and smiled, knowing what was in the food she was about to eat. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield meant privilege to outsiders, but inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our 4-bedroom house with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue at my mother Elaine's insistence, despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary in prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight A's, joined honor societies, and eventually built a career that made me a self-made millionaire. But to my husband Terrence and his overbearing family, my success was just a resource for them to exploit. Let us go back to that Sunday dinner table. The air in the formal dining room was thick with the smell of rich spices and simmering seafood. Terrence, my husband of 5 years, sat to my right. He was a real estate agent who spent more money on tailored suits and luxury car leases than he ever brought in from commissions. Across from me sat his sister Keisha, a 30-year-old woman who still expected a weekly allowance from her brother. And at the head of the table sat Mama Beatrice. She was the finance director of a massive local megachurch, a woman who wore her religion like a weapon and judged anyone who did not bow to her absolute authority. I sat perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the gleaming surface of the silver platter resting in the center of the table. That was when I saw it. Terrence reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small glass vial, and hastily tapped a heavy dose of white powder into my bowl of gumbo. He thought I was distracted by Keisha showing me a picture on her phone. He thought he was slick. My analytical mind raced instantly, piecing together the financial anomalies I had noticed in his accounts over the past month. He was broke, drowning in underground debt, and desperate. And I was worth far more to him dead or institutionalized than I was alive. Mama Beatrice cleared her throat loudly, demanding the attention of the room. She adjusted her designer glasses and looked at me with pure disdain. "Charmaine," she began, her voice dripping with fake concern. "I was speaking with the elder women at the church auxiliary board yesterday. They were asking why Terrence does not have a strong son to carry on his name yet. I had to tell them that my daughter-in-law is too focused on her little computer codes to fulfill her biological duties as a wife. It is a crying shame, really. A woman who cannot give her husband a child is practically useless to a family legacy." I felt the familiar sting of her cruelty, a poison in its own right, but today it did not break me. Today I knew exactly what kind of monsters I was sitting with. I looked her right in the eye, keeping my facial expression completely neutral. "My career is what paid for the very table we are eating on, Mama Beatrice," I replied calmly. "And it paid for the roof over your head when your church salary fell short last year." Keisha scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes as she reached for a thick piece of cornbread. "Oh, please! You act like typing on a keyboard all day makes you superior to the rest of us. Terrence is out there in the real world, closing deals, building a real estate empire, and you just sit in your home office staring at multiple screens like a weirdo. You should be down on your knees feeling grateful a handsome man like my brother even puts up with your cold, robotic attitude." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing in her face. Terrence had not closed a single real estate deal in 8 months. His so-called empire was nothing but maxed-out credit cards and hidden payday loans. But I let them have their fleeting moment of arrogant triumph. I had a much bigger game to play. Terrence cleared his throat, shifting nervously in his expensive leather chair. He pushed the bowl of tainted gumbo closer to me, his hand brushing against mine. "Come on, babe," he said, his voice carrying a false, honeyed warmth that made my skin crawl with disgust. "Eat your food before it gets cold. You know my mother spent all afternoon in the kitchen making this just for you." I looked down at the rich, dark broth. The powder had dissolved completely into the stew, leaving absolutely no trace of the heavy tranquilizers or hallucinogens he had just introduced into my meal. I needed a distraction. I needed exactly 3 seconds of unobserved time. "Terrence," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady, "could you grab the hot sauce from the kitchen counter? I think I need a little more kick to my bowl today." Terrence frowned, clearly annoyed by the delay in his twisted plan, but he nodded. "Sure, babe. Whatever you need." He stood up from his chair and turned his back to walk into the adjacent kitchen. At that exact moment, Keisha dropped her cloth napkin and bent down under the table to retrieve it. Mama Beatrice turned her head sharply to look out the bay window, complaining loudly about a neighbor's car parked too close to her driveway. The timing was absolutely flawless. My hands moved with lightning speed. I grabbed the edge of my bowl, lifted it silently, and swapped it with Mama Beatrice's identical bowl of gumbo, sitting just inches to my left. The heavy ceramic bowls traded places without making a single scraping sound against the mahogany wood. By the time Terrence walked back into the dining room, carrying the hot sauce, my hands were neatly folded in my lap and I was staring blankly at the far wall. "Here you go," Terrence said, setting the glass bottle down next to my right hand. "Now eat up. You need your strength for the week ahead." I picked up my silver spoon and dipped it into the safe, untainted broth, now sitting in front of me. "Thank you, Terrence," I said softly, looking him directly in his lying eyes. "This looks absolutely delicious." I took a measured bite. It was perfect. Then I shifted my peripheral gaze to Mama Beatrice. She had finished complaining about the neighbor and picked up her own spoon. She plunged it deeply into the bowl that had been sitting in front of me just moments prior. She scooped up a large portion of shrimp sausage and broth, blew on it delicately to cool it down, and placed it directly into her mouth. She swallowed the poison. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I started counting the seconds in my head. Based on the sheer volume of powder Terrence had dumped into that bowl, whatever cocktail of drugs he was trying to dose me with was going to hit hard, and it was going to hit incredibly fast. I kept eating my food, forcing my jaw to chew at a normal, relaxed pace. Terrence sat back in his chair, watching me intensely from across the table. He was waiting for my eyes to glaze over. He was waiting for me to collapse, seize, or start hallucinating. His complete lack of remorse was the most terrifying part of this entire ordeal. He was sitting there calmly drinking his sweet iced tea, fully prepared to watch his wife of 5 years lose her mind and potentially her life, also he could cash in on whatever twisted insurance payout he had concocted. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly, marking the passage of time. "So Charmaine," Mama Beatrice said, taking another large spoonful of the poisoned gumbo and chewing loudly. "How is that little software project of yours coming along? Are you still pretending it is going to replace a real respectable job?" "It is going very well," I replied smoothly, wiping my mouth with my napkin. "In fact, I'm about to finalize a massive security update that exposes hidden vulnerabilities in offshore financial systems. It is truly amazing what people think they can hide when they assume no one is actively watching their accounts." Terrence flinched slightly at my choice of words, a flash of genuine panic crossing his face, but he quickly recovered his composure. Keisha just snorted dismissively and went back to scrolling through her social media feed. 3 minutes had passed. Mama Beatrice was on her fourth, heavy spoonful of the contaminated stew. I watched her closely, calculating her body language. Her precise, elegant movements were starting to become slightly rigid and uncoordinated. She blinked several times rapidly, as if trying to clear a sudden heavy fog from her vision. She reached for her crystal water glass. but her hand trembled violently, causing the ice cubes to clink loudly and spill water onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Are you okay, Mama?" Keisha asked finally, looking up from her bright screen, noticing the spill. "I am fine, Mama," Beatrice snapped, though her words slurred just a fraction of a second, bleeding into one another. "Just a little hot in here. Terrence, go turn down the thermostat right now." Terrence looked confused, but stood up dutifully to adjust the central air conditioning panel on the wall. I kept eating my dinner. 4 minutes. The silence in the dining room began to stretch, pulling tight like a piano wire about to snap under immense pressure. Mama Beatrice abruptly put her spoon down. Her breathing grew incredibly shallow and uneven, her chest heaving. She stared straight ahead into empty space, her eyes widening as if she was seeing something terrifying and entirely invisible to the rest of us. "Mama Beatrice," I asked, injecting just the right amount of innocent daughterly concern into my tone. "Is the gumbo too spicy for you today?" She did not answer me. Instead, a strange low chuckle rumbled deep within her chest. It was a dark, guttural, uncharacteristic sound that made Keisha drop her phone onto the table with a loud clatter. The chuckle bubbled up her throat and erupted into a loud, uncontrollable, hysterical laugh. Mama Terrence asked, turning around from the thermostat. His face drained of all color as he looked at his mother. 5 minutes. The silent countdown in my head reached 0. Mama Beatrice threw her head back violently and let out a piercing, manic shriek of laughter that echoed off the dining room walls. Her manicured hands gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table so tightly her knuckles turned bone white. She looked wildly around the room, her pupils completely dilated, rolling back slightly into her skull. Her dignified church-going facade melted away in a single instant, replaced by a terrifying, uncontrolled madness. The laughter did not stop. It morphed into a wet, choking gasp as Mama Beatrice clawed at the collar of her custom-tailored pink suit. The room descended into absolute chaos within seconds. Darius, my brother-in-law, who had been quietly scrolling on his phone in the corner of the dining room all evening, finally looked up. He dropped his device on the thick Persian carpet, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. Keisha pushed her chair back so fast it tipped over and crashed violently against the hardwood floor. "What is wrong with her?" Keisha screamed, backing away toward the heavy mahogany china cabinet. "Terrence, do something. Call an ambulance right now." Terrence was completely frozen. He stared at his mother, his jaw tight, and then slowly turned his eyes toward the 2 identical ceramic bowls of gumbo sitting on the table. The realization hit him like a physical blow, but before he could even form a coherent thought or make a move, Mama Beatrice began to speak. Or rather, she began to project her darkest, most closely guarded secrets to the entire room at the top of her lungs. The hallucinogens had completely short-circuited the frontal lobe of her brain, stripping away decades of carefully curated religious hypocrisy. "Look at the little demons," she screeched, pointing a shaking jewel-encrusted finger directly at Keisha. "Look at them crawling all over your cheap fake hair. You think the Lord does not see you, Keisha? You think I do not know what you do when the sanctuary doors are locked?" "Know what?" Keisha stammered, looking around frantically, as if actual insects were descending from the ceiling to attack her. "Mama, sit down. You are having a medical emergency. You are having a stroke." A stroke of genius. Mama Beatrice howled, slamming her fists onto the table so hard the crystal water glasses shattered, sending shards of glass and ice flying across the table. "I know about the youth fund, you little thief. $15,000. You thought you could just skim $15,000 from the church youth retreat fund to pay for your ridiculous cosmetic surgeries and nobody would notice. I had to cook the books. I had to forge the quarterly audit reports to keep the senior pastor from calling the police on my own daughter. You are a disgrace to the sanctuary. You are a thief just like your father was." Keisha's face turned the color of wet ash. She looked at Terrence, then at Darius, her eyes wide with undeniable, paralyzing guilt. She did not even attempt to deny the accusations. The hallucination had acted as a brutal truth serum, ripping away the pious holy roller facade Mama Beatrice wore like impenetrable armor. As a forensic accountant, I cataloged every single word she said. That $15,000 discrepancy was something I could easily track through the church's public tax filings if I needed leverage later. But the drugs Terrence had procured were not just cognitive disruptors. They were a violent, deeply unstable cocktail designed to completely incapacitate the human nervous system. Suddenly, Mama Beatrice stopped yelling. Her eyes bugged out of her head and she gripped her stomach with both hands, letting out a low, agonizing groan that sounded almost demonic. The secondary compound Terrence had mixed into the powder, a massive industrial-grade dose of laxatives, took brutal and immediate effect. Right there in the middle of her pristine dining room, wearing her $2,000 Sunday church suit, Mama Beatrice lost complete control of her bodily functions. The foul, unmistakable stench filled the room, instantly overpowering the rich aroma of the seafood gumbo and the expensive spices. It was immediate, explosive, and entirely humiliating. She slumped forward in her chair, groaning and weeping, as the hallucinogens continued to scramble her brain, trapping her in a waking nightmare of her own making, while her body betrayed her in the most degrading way possible. "Oh my God," Keisha gagged, covering her nose and mouth with both hands, stumbling backward until her back hit the floral wallpaper. She ruined the custom chairs. She ruined everything. "I cannot breathe in here." Terrence did not care about the mess. He did not care about his mother crying in a puddle of her own filth. His eyes were locked entirely on me. The mask of the charming, struggling real estate agent dissolved completely, revealing the absolute predator underneath. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his tightly buttoned collar. He looked from the empty bowl in front of his mother to the barely touched bowl in front of me. He knew exactly what I had done, and he knew that I knew exactly what he was trying to do. "You switched them," he whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying homicidal fury that sent a chill down my spine. "You switched the bowls when I turned around." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I looked at the pathetic, chaotic scene unfolding around me and felt absolutely nothing but cold, calculated clarity. I did not ask him what he was talking about. I did not play dumb or act confused. I simply looked him dead in the eye and delivered the truth he could not handle. "If you are going to try and drug your wife to steal a massive life insurance policy, Terrence, you really should not turn your back to get the hot sauce. It is sloppy work, just like your fake real estate accounting. Did you really think I would not notice the offshore transfers?" That was the breaking point. The sound that ripped from Terrence's throat was not human. It was the roar of a cornered animal realizing its trap had snapped shut on its own leg. He lunged across the wide mahogany table, shattering plates and sending silver cutlery flying in every direction. His heavy boots crushed the spilled food as he scrambled over the wood, his hands outstretched like rigid claws. I barely had time to shift my weight backward before his fingers wrapped around my throat. He tackled me, my heavy wooden chair crashing to the floor with a deafening thud. The back of my head slammed against the Persian rug, stars bursting in my vision, but the adrenaline flooded my system instantly. His thumbs pressed deep into my windpipe, brutally cutting off my oxygen supply. His face was inches from mine, spit flying from his lips as he screamed, "I am going to kill you. You ruined everything. You ruined my life. You arrogant, cold-hearted witch. I needed that money. Darius owes the cartel $3 million and you ruined the plan. I will snap your neck right here and tell them you attacked my mother." I clawed at his wrists, my meticulously manicured nails digging deep into his skin, drawing crescent-shaped beads of blood. But he was too heavy, too desperate. The edges of my vision began to darken, a fuzzy gray ring closing in on the periphery of my sight. I needed to breathe. I bucked my hips upward, trying to dislodge his center of gravity, but he pinned my legs down with his knees. Keisha was screaming hysterically in the background, but she did not step forward to help me. She just stood against the wall and watched her brother strangle his wife to death. Darius Terrence roared without looking back, his grip tightening even further. "Help me hold her down. Grab something. Hit her in the head." Darius, whose own life was apparently on the line with whatever underground syndicate he owed money to, snapped out of his shock. He grabbed the heavy wooden dining chair Keisha had knocked over earlier. He lifted it high above his head, stepping carefully over his mother, who was still rolling on the floor, laughing and crying in her own waist. Darius raised the heavy chair, his eyes fixed intensely on my forehead. He was going to cave my skull in and frame it as an accident. He was going to finish what the poison was supposed to start. I stopped struggling against Terrence's grip for a fraction of a second. I let my body go entirely limp. Terrence felt the sudden lack of resistance and, anticipating my loss of consciousness, slightly relaxed his crushing grip on my windpipe to catch his own breath. That was all the leverage my body needed. I brought my right knee up with every ounce of strength I had left, driving it violently into his groin. Terrence let out a high-pitched, breathless gasp, his eyes widening in pure agony. His hands released my throat immediately as he rolled off my chest, curling into a tight fetal position on the floor, clutching himself and groaning in pain. I gasped desperately for air, rolling onto my side, just as Darius brought the heavy oak chair crashing down. The thick wooden legs smashed into the floorboards mere inches from my face, splintering the polished wood into jagged pieces. I scrambled backward across the floor, coughing violently, my throat burning like I had swallowed hot coals. Darius raised the broken chair again, stepping forward to deliver a second fatal blow. I reached into the pocket of my slacks and pulled out my phone, but I did not need to make a call. The fail-safe I had established before I even walked into this house was already in motion. 10 minutes ago, right when Mama Beatrice had started her lecture about my lack of children, I had reached under the table and pressed the emergency SOS button on my Apple Watch. I knew the moment I swapped those bowls that violence was the only language this family had left. I had silently broadcasted my exact GPS location and an open real-time audio feed directly to the local emergency dispatch center. They had heard the confession about the stolen church funds. They had heard Terrence admit to the massive cartel debt. And they had heard him threatening to snap my neck. Before Darius could swing the shattered chair a second time, the piercing, unmistakable wail of police sirens flooded the quiet suburban neighborhood, instantly drowning out Keisha's screaming and Mama Beatrice's psychotic laughter. Red and blue lights flashed wildly through the large bay windows, painting the dining room in a chaotic, strobing glare. Darius froze, the chair still suspended high above his head. He looked toward the window, absolute panic washing over his face. He dropped the chair with a loud clatter and immediately bolted toward the back door, abandoning his brother and his mother without a single second thought. Heavy, hurried footsteps pounded up the front concrete steps. Fists pounded against the solid oak front door, followed immediately by the splintering crash of a heavy tactical battering ram. The thick wooden door burst open off its hinges, and 3 heavily armed police officers flooded into the foyer, their bright tactical flashlights cutting through the dim hallway. "Police, drop your weapons. Show me your hands right now." I remained on the floor, clutching my deeply bruised throat, deliberately looking as helpless and terrified as possible. Terrence, still grimacing in intense pain, fought his way to his knees. He looked at the armed officers, their weapons drawn, and then looked directly at me. In a split second, his twisted survival instinct hijacked his brain. He raised his hands in the air, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "Officers, help us!" Terrence screamed, perfectly mimicking the frantic terror of a traumatized victim. "Arrest my wife. She poisoned my mother's food and just tried to kill me. She is completely insane. Arrest her now." The officers did not hesitate. They did not look at the shattered pieces of the heavy oak chair lying inches from my head. They did not notice the dark crescent-shaped fingernail marks and the brutal bruising already blooming across my windpipe where Terrence had just tried to squeeze the life out of me. They saw a screaming, seemingly traumatized husband begging for help. They saw an older woman rolling on the floor in a state of absolute grotesque psychosis. And they saw me sitting silently on the floor. Their implicit bias made the decision for them in a fraction of a second. 2 officers lunged forward, grabbing my arms and brutally wrenching them behind my back. I felt the cold, heavy metal of the handcuffs bite viciously into my wrists as the ratchets clicked shut. I did not fight back. I knew better than to resist arrest. I went entirely limp, allowing them to haul me up from the ruined dining room floor. As they dragged me toward the broken front door, I locked eyes with Terrence. He was still kneeling on the floor, pretending to cry for the benefit of the police, but the moment the officers turned their backs, a slow, malicious smirk spread across his face. He mouthed the words, "Game over." I was shoved into the back of a smelling, hard plastic seat of a police cruiser. The ride to the precinct was a blur of flashing lights and the crackle of the police radio. I sat in silence, analyzing the board like a grandmaster playing a high-stakes game of chess. Terrence thought he had checkmated me. He thought the police would lock me away, giving him free rein to execute whatever contingency plan he had for the life insurance and the cartel debt. He had no idea what was coming. At the precinct, I was stripped of my personal belongings, save for my clothes, and thrown into a freezing, windowless interrogation room. My left wrist was cuffed to a heavy metal ring bolted to the steel table. The walls were painted a sickening shade of institutional gray. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed aggressively overhead. The air smelled of stale coffee and old sweat. I sat there for 3 agonizing hours. This was a classic interrogation tactic. They wanted to break my spirit, isolate me, and let the panic set in before they even asked a single question. But I was not panicking. I was waiting. Finally, the heavy metal door swung open. 2 detectives walked in. The lead was a tall, broad-shouldered white man in a cheap suit who looked like he had not slept in days. His name tag read, Detective Miller. Behind him was a younger female detective, Detective Reynolds, carrying a thick manila folder. Neither of them looked at me with an ounce of objective curiosity. They looked at me like I was already convicted. Miller pulled out a metal chair and sat down heavily across from me. He folded his hands on the table. Reynolds stood by the door, her arms crossed tight against her chest. Charmaine Miller began, his voice dripping with condescension. "Do you know how much trouble you are in right now? Your mother-in-law is currently in the intensive care unit having her stomach pumped. She is suffering from severe cardiac distress induced by a massive overdose of ketamine and industrial laxatives. Your husband is in the waiting room terrified for his life. He told us everything." I sat up perfectly straight, making direct eye contact with Miller. "I would like to state for the record that my husband violently attacked me. If you look at my neck, you will see the physical evidence of strangulation. Furthermore, my brother-in-law Darius attempted to strike me with a wooden chair. I was the one who triggered the emergency SOS. Reynolds scoffed loudly from the corner of the room. "Give it a rest, Charmaine. We have already taken statements from Terrence and Keisha. They both confirmed that you attacked Terrence when he tried to stop you from fleeing the scene after you poisoned his mother. The bruising on your neck is from him trying to restrain you. Self-defense." It was a beautifully constructed lie. Terrence had anticipated my defense and flipped the narrative instantly, but he had not just stopped at witness statements. Detective Miller reached out, took the thick manila folder from Reynolds, and slammed it down onto the steel table between us. He flipped it open, revealing stacks of printed documents, medical letterheads, and prescription logs. "We know about your condition," Charmaine Miller said, his tone shifting from aggressive to a mockingly gentle pity that made my stomach turn. "Terrence gave us full access to your medical history. He brought these files straight from his home safe. He told us how hard he has been trying to manage your illness behind closed doors to protect your high-powered corporate career." I frowned slightly, genuinely confused for a fraction of a second. "My illness." Reynolds walked forward and tapped a manicured finger on the top document. "Do not play dumb. We have your psychiatric evaluation records right here. Signed by Dr. Eris Thorne. Diagnoses of severe paranoid schizophrenia, chronic delusions, and violent manic episodes. We have a 6-month history of forged therapy notes detailing your irrational belief that your husband's family was trying to steal from you. We even have pharmacy records showing you have been refusing to take your prescribed antipsychotic medication for the last 8 weeks. My mind raced, the forensic accountant inside me rapidly decoding the data. Terrence had not just decided to drug me tonight on a whim. This had been in motion for half a year. He had found a corrupt doctor or completely fabricated the identity of one. He had generated a flawless, verifiable paper trail of mental instability. He had built an entire alternative reality in the public record. If I died, he was the grieving widower of a tragic suicide. If I survived as I had tonight, he was the victim of a violently insane wife. Either way, he gained full legal conservatorship over my estate, my bank accounts, and my life insurance. It was absolutely brilliant and entirely evil. They want to build the narrative of the crazy, dangerous black woman, I realized silently. It is the easiest story for the system to swallow. The police would look at my success, look at my wealth, and easily believe the lie that the pressure had completely cracked my mind. Terrence loves you, Charmaine Miller continued, leaning in closer. He does not want to see you go to a maximum security prison. He wants to get you the help you need. But you have to cooperate with us. You need to sign a full confession detailing exactly how you put the drugs in the food. If you confess right now, I can talk to the district attorney. We can bypass a criminal trial and petition for a mandatory indefinite psychiatric hold. You will go to a secure hospital instead of a penitentiary. They were trying to strong-arm me into a false confession. They wanted to close the case before the end of their shift. And if I refused to sign your fabricated confession, I asked softly, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Miller slammed his hand on the table, the loud crack echoing in the small room. Then I will charge you with first-degree attempted murder. I will charge you with aggravated assault. I will make sure the prosecutor asks for no bail. You will sit in a county jail cell while we take this to a jury. With your medical records and 2 eyewitness testimonies against you, you are looking at 20 years behind bars. You will lose your license, your career, your house, and your freedom. Your life as you know it is over. The silence in the room stretched out heavy and suffocating. Reynolds looked at me with disgust. Miller looked at me with impatient anger. They expected me to break. They expected the tears to fall. They expected the panicked begging of a woman whose entire world had just been systematically dismantled by the man she married. Instead, I let out a slow, deliberate breath, and then I smiled. It was not a small smile. It was a wide, genuine, completely relaxed smile that reached my eyes. I saw the immediate confusion register on Miller's face. He recoiled slightly, likely thinking the alleged schizophrenia was manifesting right in front of him. You think this is funny? Reynolds snapped, stepping toward the table. You are looking at 2 decades in a cage, you psycho. I leaned forward as far as the handcuffs would allow. The metal chain clinked sharply against the table. I looked directly into Detective Miller's eyes. I think it is hilarious. Detective, I said, my voice steady and commanding. I think it is hilarious that in your rush to close this case, you completely failed to perform a basic physical search of a corporate fraud investigator. You read those fake medical files and decided you had all the answers. But you missed one very important detail about what I do for a living. Miller frowned, his eyes narrowing. What are you talking about? In my line of work, I deal with men who lie for a living, I explained calmly. Embezzlers, corrupt executives, money launderers. I walk into hostile environments every single day. I never walk into a room without an insurance policy. And I certainly do not sit down to dinner with a husband I know is drowning in cartel debt without keeping my eyes wide open. I shifted my shoulders slightly, sitting up taller. Detective Miller, I want you to look closely at my silk blouse. Notice the top button right below my collarbone. Miller squinted, leaning across the table to inspect my shirt. It is not a button, I whispered. It is a high-definition wide-angle microlens connected to a continuous loop recording device hidden in the lining of my bra. It records both video and crystal-clear audio. It has been recording since I walked into that dining room 2 hours ago. It recorded Terrence pulling the vial from his pocket. It recorded him dumping the powder into my bowl. It recorded me swapping the bowls while his back was turned. And it recorded his full confession about his $3 million debt while his hands were wrapped around my throat. The color instantly drained from Detective Miller's face. Reynolds stopped breathing, her eyes darting from me to the supposed button on my blouse. Now I said, my smile turning into a sharp, predatory grin. Be a gentleman. Unbutton the top button of my silk blouse, pull out the device and plug it into your laptop. Let us watch the tape, Detective. Detective Miller stared at me for a long, heavy moment. The arrogance had entirely vanished from his face, replaced by a pale, creeping dread. His hand shook slightly. As he reached across the steel table, his thick fingers clumsily unfastening the top silk button of my blouse. He pulled the tiny black magnetic device free and held it up to the harsh fluorescent light as if holding a live grenade. Detective Reynolds did not say a single word. She simply walked over to the table, opened her heavy silver laptop, and plugged the micro USB drive directly into the port. The interrogation room fell dead silent as the video player launched. There it was in crisp, high-definition color and perfect, unfiltered audio. The recording showed the dining room from my exact point of view. They watched Terrence reach into his expensive tailored jacket. They watched him unscrew the tiny glass vial. They watched the white powder fall silently into my bowl of seafood gumbo. Then the camera shifted wildly for a fraction of a second as I reached across the table and swapped the bowls while his back was turned. They heard Terrence's falsely sweet voice urging me to eat. They heard Mama Beatrice's vile, hypocritical insults about my career and my inability to bear children. But the most damning part was the end. The detectives watched in stunned horror as Terrence violently tackled me to the floor. The audio was crystal clear. They heard every word of his unhinged, desperate confession. They heard him explicitly state his intention to murder me. They heard him explicitly confirm Darius owed $3 million to an underground cartel. They heard him explicitly state that my death was the solution to their massive debt. Reynolds slammed the laptop shut. She looked at me, her face flushed with a mixture of profound embarrassment and professional panic. They had almost railroaded an innocent woman into a 20-year prison sentence or a lifetime in a maximum security psychiatric ward based entirely on forged documents provided by the actual attempted murderer. "Unlock the cuffs." Miller ordered, his voice thick and raspy. He did not look at me. He could not look at me. "Do it right now." Reynolds scrambled to pull the small metal key from her heavy-duty belt. She fumbled with the locks, her hands trembling nervously as the heavy steel cuffs finally snapped open. I rubbed my bruised wrists slowly, taking my time, letting the crushing weight of their colossal failure sit heavily in the small, stifling room. "We are extremely sorry," Charmaine Miller stammered, pulling out his shoulder radio. "I am issuing an immediate statewide arrest warrant for Terrence and Darius. We will send units back to the house and to the hospital right now. You are free to go. We will need the camera as evidence, but you can collect your personal belongings at the front desk." I did not say thank you. I simply stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from my silk trousers, and walked out of the interrogation room without a backward glance. I navigated the busy, brightly lit corridors of the precinct, my mind already 10 steps ahead of the police. Terrence was a coward, but he was a desperate coward with a massive head start. He knew the police would eventually figure out the truth, even if he thought I was locked away for the night. He would not just sit in the hospital waiting room playing the devoted son. I reached the front desk and signed the release forms to get my personal property back. The desk sergeant handed me my leather handbag, my car keys, and my phone. The battery was at 40%. As soon as I powered the device on the screen, completely froze. For a full 10 seconds, the processor struggled to handle the sheer volume of incoming data. And then the notification chimes began. It was not a single alert. It was a rapid, continuous cascade of metallic pings that sounded like a slot machine paying out a jackpot. But this was not a victory. This was an absolute financial slaughter. I stood in the middle of the crowded police lobby, my eyes scanning the notifications pouring in from 5 different banking applications. Alert. Transfer of $50,000 from joint savings to external account approved. Alert. Transfer of $75,000 from emergency fund money market to external account approved. Alert. Credit line advance of $40,000 initiated. Alert. Home equity line of credit drawn for maximum available balance of $90,000. My heart slammed against my ribs, but the forensic accountant in me instantly suppressed the rising panic. I opened the banking applications one by one. The balances were zero. Negative. Maxed out to the absolute limit. I sat in a hard plastic chair against the lobby wall, my fingers numb analyzing the timestamps. He had executed the first transfer exactly 4 minutes after the police dragged me out of the dining room. He had literally been tapping the authorized buttons on his phone while he was faking tears in front of the arresting officers. The sheer sociopathic calculation of it all was breathtaking. He had bypassed the two-factor authentication by intercepting the security codes routed to our home landline, which he had clearly forwarded to his own mobile device before the dinner even started. He had drained over $250,000 in pure liquid cash in less than 180 minutes. My entire safety net, the money I had worked 70-hour weeks to build from the ground up, was completely gone. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the precinct and stepped out into the freezing torrential rain. The storm had finally broken over the city, washing the dark streets in a cold, unforgiving downpour. I pulled my coat tightly around my shoulders and sprinted to my car parked 3 blocks away in a dimly lit municipal lot. Just as I slid into the driver's seat, shivering and soaked to the bone, my phone rang. It was Detective Miller. Charmaine, his voice was tight, completely breathless. "We sent squad cars to the hospital to arrest Terrence. He is gone." I started the engine, blasting the heat to stop my teeth from chattering. Gone where, I asked, though I already knew the answer deep in my gut. "He never even checked his mother into the intensive care unit," Miller explained, the frustration evident in his harsh tone. "The triage nurse said Terrence brought Mama Beatrice into the emergency room lobby, but the moment he saw a uniformed transit officer standing near the vending machines, he panicked. He grabbed her wheelchair, turned right back around, and shoved her into the back of his luxury SUV. He smuggled an actively overdosing woman out of a medical facility. We have traffic cameras tracking his vehicle, heading northbound out of the city limits, but he has shut off his cell phone entirely. We do not know where he is taking her." "He is taking her to his secure location," I replied, my voice completely devoid of panic. "He needs her alive, Detective. She is the finance director of a megachurch. She controls millions in untaxed donations, property deeds, and anonymous charity routing numbers. If he is running, he needs her access codes to leverage the church assets. He is going to drain the congregation just like he drained me. We will find him, Charmaine, I promise you." I hung up the phone without another word. I did not trust Detective Miller to find his own car keys, let alone a desperate cornered man running from cartel enforcers. I looked down at my designer wallet sitting on the passenger seat. I opened it. I had exactly $12 in crumpled cash and a stack of premium credit cards that were currently burning holes through my flawless credit score. Terrence thought he had broken me. He thought leaving me penniless and stranded in the rain would force me to surrender. He forgot that true wealth is not just numbers in a bank account. Wealth is knowledge. And I knew how to track hidden money better than anyone on the eastern seaboard. I reached into the back seat and grabbed my heavy, reinforced briefcase. I pulled out my primary workstation, a high-end laptop heavily encrypted and loaded with proprietary forensic tracing software. I plugged the computer into the car power inverter, flipped open the screen, and tethered it to my phone mobile hotspot. The cool blue glow of the screen illuminated the dark rain-streaked interior of my car. I cracked my knuckles, the bruising on my neck throbbing with a dull, persistent ache, and went to work. I logged directly into the back-end administrative portals of my compromised bank accounts. I bypassed the standard user interface and pulled the raw, unfiltered transaction logs. I needed the destination routing numbers and the specific IP addresses of the devices that authorized the final outgoing transfers. Terrence was incredibly sloppy. He was moving way too fast, fueled by adrenaline, greed, and terror. He had masked his digital location using a basic commercial virtual private network, but a cheap commercial VPN is absolutely nothing against military-grade packet-sniffing algorithms. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing complex lines of code into the command terminal. I stripped away the false IP addresses layer by layer. I watched the digital trail bounce from a proxy server in Miami to a relay station in London and finally drop its heavy anchor. I stared at the final destination data populating on my screen, the breath suddenly catching in my throat. The money had not been wired to a traditional offshore bank account in the Cayman Islands or Switzerland. Traditional banks require holding periods and compliance checks. Terrence could not afford to wait for banking hours. The entire $250,000 had been instantly converted through an unregulated shadow exchange into untraceable cryptocurrency. But that was not what made my blood run cold. I ran the destination wallet address through an international threat database I frequently used for high-level corporate espionage cases. The system flagged the alphanumeric address instantly. Bright red warning banners flooded my entire screen, flashing aggressively in the dark car. This digital wallet did not belong to a local neighborhood bookie. It did not belong to a disorganized street gang. The digital signature matched a known laundering node exclusively used by an incredibly violent international trafficking syndicate operating out of Eastern Europe and the Caribbean. Darius did not just owe money to bad men playing poker in a basement. He owed money to a sophisticated organization that routinely dismantled entire corporations, bribed federal judges, and assassinated rivals to collect their outstanding debts. And Terrence had just funneled my entire life savings directly into their central ledger as a microscopic down payment. I sat completely alone in my car, the rain pounding violently against the windshield, the flashing red alerts reflecting in my wide eyes. This was no longer just a bitter domestic dispute. This was no longer just about a toxic family trying to steal a house or cash in an insurance policy. My husband and his family were deeply, inextricably embedded in a massive, coordinated criminal syndicate. Terrence had smuggled Mama Beatrice away, not just to hide from the local police, but to hide from the cartel enforcers who were undoubtedly coming to collect the remaining $2.75 million Darius still owed them. I closed the laptop with a sharp, echoing snap. I was totally broke. I was physically exhausted. My throat was bruised and heavily swollen. But for the first time since this terrible nightmare began, I was not playing defense anymore. I started the car engine, shifted the gear into drive, and pulled out into the stormy night. It was time to go hunting. I navigated the slick, flooded streets of Atlanta with a cold, mechanical precision. I could not go back to my house. The police might be there processing the scene, or worse, Terrence might have sent someone from the cartel to finish the job he started. I needed a secure location with blazing fast internet and absolute privacy. I drove directly to my corporate office building. I parked in the heavily guarded underground garage, flashed my platinum clearance badge to the night security watchman, and took the private executive elevator straight to the 24th floor. The office was pitch black, silent, and completely secure. I walked into my corner office, locked the heavy reinforced glass door behind me, and plugged my laptop directly into the company mainframe. I needed the massive processing power of our enterprise servers to crack Terrence's hidden files. I had managed his digital life for years. I knew his primary passwords, his security questions, and his recovery emails. He was a vain, predictable man who used his high school football jersey number and his mother's birth year for almost everything. But when I logged into his main cloud drive, I found exactly what I expected: a hidden, heavily encrypted partition. He had likely paid someone a lot of money to set it up, but it was nothing compared to the proprietary forensic decryption algorithms I used to dismantle fraudulent offshore corporations on a daily basis. I routed the encrypted partition through our mainframe, launching a brute force attack designed to shatter commercial-grade firewalls in minutes. While the algorithm ran, I stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the rain-soaked Atlanta skyline. My throat still throbbed intensely. The phantom feeling of Terrence's hands squeezing my windpipe was a dark reminder of exactly who I was dealing with. He was not just a greedy husband anymore. He was an active, lethal threat. A sharp metallic beep from my laptop pulled my attention back to the screen. The firewall had collapsed. The encrypted vault was completely open. I clicked into the first folder labeled with a simple, innocuous sequence of numbers. Inside was a single, massive PDF document. I opened it, my eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal jargon and the actuarial tables. It was a comprehensive life insurance policy underwritten by a massive international financial firm. The insured party was me, Charmaine. The sole primary beneficiary was Terrence. I looked at the total payout amount and the breath hitched in my damaged throat. $5 million. I scrolled down to the execution dates. The policy had been initiated exactly 30 days ago. It carried a massive monthly premium, one that Terrence could never afford on his own. That meant he had likely borrowed the initial payment from the very people he currently owed, promising them a massive return on their investment. But what made my blood run entirely cold was the specific rider attached to the policy. It was a double indemnity clause that guaranteed immediate payout in the event of an accidental death. The clause specifically excluded suicide, but fully covered fatal accidents caused by medical delirium, psychological episodes, or prescription drug interactions. The entire horrifying puzzle snapped together in my mind with perfect clarity. The fake psychiatric records, the forged history of severe schizophrenia, the heavy dose of hallucinogens and tranquilizers he dumped into my dinner tonight. Terrence never intended to leave me in a psychiatric ward. A secure hospital would eventually figure out I was perfectly sane. A hospital would run blood tests and find the industrial laxatives in the ketamine. He was going to drug me until I was completely delirious. He was going to put me behind the wheel of my car or lead me out into heavy downtown traffic and stage a horrific fatal accident. The police would look at my fabricated medical history, see a woman suffering from an acute psychotic break, and rule my death a tragic, unavoidable accident. Terrence would play the grieving widower, collect the $5 million tax-free, and walk away completely clean. I was worth $250,000 to him alive and bleeding, but I was worth $5 million to him dead. I felt a violent wave of nausea wash over me, but I swallowed it down forcefully. Panic was a luxury I could not afford right now. I needed to understand why. Terrence was arrogant and lazy, but orchestrating a flawless murder required a level of desperate motivation he did not naturally possess. He needed a reason to risk the electric chair. I backed out of the insurance folder and clicked into a secondary directory titled Property Valuations. It was not real estate data. It was a massive archive of exported encrypted messaging logs. Telegram, Signal, WhatsApp. He had backed everything up likely as an insurance policy of his own in case his partners ever turned on him. I opened the primary chat log. It was a group thread between Terrence Darius and a third user utilizing a burner number with a Miami area code. The messages were terrifying. They were not vague threats. They were highly specific, deeply coordinated instructions. The user from Miami had sent multiple surveillance photos of Darius. Photos of Darius walking to his car. Photos of Darius eating at a local diner. Photos of Mama Beatrice leaving her megachurch on a Sunday afternoon. Attached to the photos was a simple, chilling message. You have 48 hours to balance the ledger, or we start breaking bones. The principal balance is $3 million. No more extensions. No more excuses. I read Terrence's frantic replies. He was begging. He was negotiating for his brother's life and his own kneecaps. Please just give me until the end of the month. I have a guaranteed $5 million payout coming. It is locked in. I am executing the final phase tonight. I just sent you $250,000 in crypto as a good faith deposit. Please do not touch my mother. The plan happens tonight. Darius had lost $3 million of cartel money in a botched cryptocurrency pump and dump scheme. The people he stole from did not care about apologies or bad market timing. They wanted their money, and they were perfectly willing to slaughter the entire family to make an example of them. Terrence, in a desperate bid to save his brother and protect himself from the fallout, had offered me up as the sacrificial lamb. He was trading my life to pay off their debts, using my murder as the ultimate currency. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, the cool blue glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes. The sheer scale of their betrayal was staggering. The entire family knew. Mama Beatrice knew I was going to be eliminated. Keisha knew. They had all sat around that dining table eating their dinner, smiling at me, fully aware that I was not supposed to survive the night. I saved the chat logs, the insurance documents, and the cryptocurrency transfer receipts directly to an encrypted external hard drive. I had the motive. I had the cartel connection. I had everything I needed to ensure Terrence and Darius never saw the light of day again. But the forensic accountant in me knew that the money trail was never quite finished. There's always one more loose end, one more hidden asset they forgot to scrub. Terrence had drained my liquid cash, but what about the physical assets? I opened a new browser tab and logged directly into the county property records database. I pulled up the deed to my house. I had bought that sprawling property with my own money before Terrence and I were even married, but I had foolishly added his name to the deed as a gesture of trust and marital unity. I refreshed the page expecting to see a clean title. Instead, a brand new lien populated on the screen. It was a second mortgage filed and notarized just 3 days ago. Terrence had leveraged the massive equity in our home to pull out a massive line of credit. I opened the scanned PDF of the mortgage agreement. There was my signature flawlessly forged at the bottom of the page. Terrence had perfectly copied the way I looped my letters. But it was the second signature on the document that made my heart stop entirely. Right next to Terrence's name was a co-signer, a woman, Sarah Collins. I stared at the name, Sarah Collins. I ran the name through my memory, filtering through distant cousins, Terrence's past clients, colleagues from his failing real estate agency. Nothing. I had absolutely no idea who this woman was. Why would a complete stranger be co-signing a massive second mortgage on my house? And more importantly, how did a traditional bank approve a massive loan with a forged primary signature and a random co-signer? I zoomed in on the notary seal stamped at the bottom of the document. The notary block included the address where the signatures were executed and legally verified. It was not a bank branch. It was not a generic public notary office in a strip mall. It was a commercial address. Suite 4500. I highlighted the address, copied it, and pasted it into a search engine. The results loaded instantly, and the breath was completely knocked out of my lungs for the second time that night. The address belonged to Sterling and Hayes Associates. It was not a mortgage brokerage. It was not a title company. It was one of the most ruthless, high-end, and expensive family law firms in downtown Atlanta. They specialized in one thing and one thing only: high-net-worth hostile divorces. Terrence was not just planning to murder me. He had a backup plan, a mistress, a legal ambush. And whoever this Sarah Collins was, she was sitting right in the middle of a prestigious law firm helping my husband steal my house out from under me, while I was busy fighting for my life in a cold interrogation room. I looked at the digital clock on my computer screen. It was 4 in the morning. The sun would be up soon. The banks would open. The law firms would unlock their heavy glass doors. I closed the laptop, slid it into my reinforced briefcase, and stood up. The fear was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating rage. Terrence thought he had played the ultimate hand. He thought he had left me with absolutely nothing. He was about to learn what happens when you try to steal from a woman who builds empires for a living. I grabbed my keys and headed for the elevator. I had a very important appointment to make in downtown Atlanta. I arrived at the towering glass and steel skyscraper housing Sterling and Hayes Associates just as the heavy rain finally began to taper off into a cold, miserable drizzle. The sun struggled to pierce the thick gray clouds hanging over downtown Atlanta, casting long, harsh shadows across the wet pavement. I parked my car in the adjacent parking garage, grabbed my reinforced briefcase, and walked straight through the massive revolving doors of the lobby. I did not bother checking my reflection in the glass. I knew exactly what I looked like. My hair was damp, my clothes were wrinkled from sitting in a police precinct, and my car all night, and my neck was ringed with the ugly dark purple bruises Terrence had left on my skin. But I did not care. I was not here to look presentable. I was here to freeze my assets and burn a hole right through his contingency plan. I rode the high-speed elevator up to the 45th floor in total silence. When the polished metal doors slid open, I stepped out into a reception area that practically screamed exorbitant wealth. The floors were imported Italian marble. The walls were paneled in rich, dark mahogany. A massive abstract modern art piece hung behind a sleek, minimalist reception desk crafted from a single slab of white quartz. This was not a firm that handled simple traffic tickets. This was a firm that dissolved multi-million-dollar estates, orchestrated hostile corporate takeovers, and buried financial scandals for Atlanta's elite. Sitting behind the quartz desk was a young woman. She had bright, perfectly styled blonde hair, pale skin, and was wearing a tailored designer dress that easily cost more than a paralegal made in a month. She was typing rapidly on a high-end mechanical keyboard, not even bothering to look up as I approached. Welcome to Sterling and Hayes, she said, her voice dripping with practiced corporate artificiality. Do you have an appointment with one of our partners? I stopped right in front of her desk. I looked down at the engraved silver nameplate resting next to her multi-line telephone console. It read Sarah Collins. The air in my lungs turned to solid ice. This was her, the woman who had co-signed the fraudulent second mortgage on my house just 3 days ago. I stood entirely still, my forensic mind analyzing every single detail about her in a fraction of a second. She was 25, maybe 26 years old at most. She wore a heavy gold Cartier love bracelet on her right wrist, the exact same bracelet I had noticed on Terrence's credit card statement 6 months ago, which he swore was a corporate gift for a wealthy female client. I am looking for Sarah Collins, I said, keeping my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. She finally stopped typing. She looked up, her blue eyes scanning my wrinkled clothes, my unkempt hair, and the dark bruising around my throat. A flicker of something crossed her face. It was not confusion. It was not polite professional concern. It was recognition. She knew exactly who I was before I even said my name. I am Sarah, she replied, leaning back in her ergonomic leather chair and crossing her arms. And you must be Charmaine. Terrence told me you were intense, but I did not expect you to show up at my place of work, looking like you just crawled out of a dumpster. She did not flinch. She did not panic at the sight of the lawful wife standing in front of her. Instead, a slow, incredibly smug smile spread across her face. The sheer audacity of her reaction confirmed everything I needed to know about Terrence's hidden life. I placed my briefcase on the pristine surface of her desk. I'm going to make this very simple for you, Sarah. I know about the second mortgage you signed on my property 3 days ago. I know Terrence forged my signature on the primary application. I am here to speak with the senior managing partner of this firm to inform them that their receptionist is actively participating in a massive bank fraud scheme, and then I am calling the federal authorities. Sarah laughed. It was a bright, airy, mocking sound that echoed loudly in the cavernous marble lobby. She did not reach for the phone. She did not buzz for a manager. She simply reached out and adjusted her gold bracelet. You are not calling anyone, Charmaine, Sarah said, her voice dropping the professional customer service tone and taking on a sharp, venomous edge. And you are certainly not seeing a partner. You really think you are the first angry wife who has marched in here waving her hands around. You have absolutely no idea how any of this works. I remained perfectly still. Educate me, I challenged softly. Terrence and I have been together for 3 years, she stated proudly as if announcing an achievement. 3 years. While you were sitting in your home office staring at spreadsheets, he was with me. He only married you because of your flawless credit score and your corporate salary. You were nothing but a bankroll to him, a stiff, boring accountant who provided the financial stability he needed while he figured out his real estate investments. Real estate investments, I repeated, almost amused by her profound ignorance. You mean his $3 million debt to an international cartel? Sarah waved her hand dismissively. I know all about his brother's little gambling problem. Terrence is handling it, and part of that handling involves liquidating dead weight. Which brings us to the house. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk, her eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. You see, Charmaine, you are very smart with numbers, but you are incredibly stupid when it comes to the law. That document you think is a forged mortgage application is not a standard loan. It was a collateralized debt obligation wrapped in a blind trust. Terrence used a fully notarized, completely legal general power of attorney to execute the paperwork. A power of attorney you signed last year when you two were setting up your joint tax shelter. Remember that? My mind flashed back to the previous tax season. Terrence had shoved a stack of documents in front of me while I was on an urgent conference call, claiming it was just standard filing paperwork for our accountant. I had signed it without conducting my usual thorough review. It was the single biggest mistake of my entire life. He used that power of attorney to authorize a massive equity withdrawal. Sarah continued, thoroughly enjoying every second of her monologue. But he did not take the money in cash. He transferred the equity liability directly to a limited liability company, an LLC, that I fully own and operate. When the primary mortgage defaults at the end of this month, my LLC is legally positioned to assume full ownership of the property deed in exchange for settling the debt. It is a completely airtight legal loophole designed by the best attorneys in this very building. You do not own that house anymore, Charmaine. I do. She smiled brightly, showing off her perfectly straight white teeth. Terrence and I are moving in together as soon as the eviction notice clears. So you can take your little briefcase and walk right back out into the rain. You have absolutely nothing left. Terrence took your cash, he took your house, and he took your dignity. I looked at this arrogant 25-year-old woman. She genuinely believed she had outsmarted a senior forensic investigator. She genuinely believed that holding a piece of paper orchestrated by a desperate cartel-indebted coward made her untouchable. She was standing on the deck of the Titanic bragging about the luxurious quality of her deck chair, while the ship was already entirely underwater. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not validate her cruel little victory by showing a single ounce of emotional distress. I simply stared at her with a look of profound clinical pity. "You think you won a prize, Sarah?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You think Terrence loves you." Terrence drugged my food last night. He tried to strangle me to death on his mother's dining room floor so he could collect a $5 million life insurance payout to save his brother from being dismembered by Eastern European gangsters. The police are currently hunting him down for attempted murder. And the moment they catch him, they are going to look at the woman who just fraudulently assumed ownership of his primary asset. Sarah's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny flicker of doubt crossing her pale features, but she quickly masked it with aggressive indignation. "You are a liar," she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "Terrence warned me you would try to make up crazy stories to ruin his reputation. He told me you were mentally unstable." She slammed her hand down on the desk and grabbed the sleek black telephone receiver. "I am done listening to your psychotic delusions. You need to leave my firm right now. If you do not turn around and walk out those doors, I am calling building security. I am not going to sit here and be threatened by an angry black woman causing a scene in my lobby." There it was, the ultimate predictable weapon. The moment she felt even slightly threatened by my composure, she immediately weaponized my race. She wanted me to raise my voice. She wanted me to snatch the phone out of her hand. She wanted the large armed security guards in the lobby downstairs to come up here and see a loud, aggressive black woman terrorizing a fragile blonde receptionist. It was a trap I had navigated my entire corporate life. I did not take the bait. I simply smiled, a cold, empty expression that made her hand freeze on the telephone dial pad. While she was entirely focused on trying to provoke a reaction out of me, my eyes naturally drifted down to the surface of her pristine quartz desk. Beneath her manicured hand lay a stack of freshly printed documents. They were wire transfer authorization forms likely waiting to be filed or shredded. My eyes automatically scanned the columns of numbers. It was a reflex I could not turn off. I read routing numbers the way other people read the morning news. I scanned the first line. I scanned the second line. Then my eyes locked onto the third string of numbers. 0, 4, 1, 2, 8, 7, 9. My breath stopped in my throat. I knew that specific routing number. I had seen it dozens of times when I helped Terrence file his preliminary tax returns early in our marriage. I had seen it again just hours ago when I was tearing through his encrypted hard drive. It was the primary routing number for Mama Beatrice's megachurch donation fund, the secure tax-exempt account where thousands of devoted parishioners deposited their hard-earned tithes every single Sunday. I looked closer, reading the destination column next to the routing number. The wire transfer was not directing church funds to a charity. The transfer form indicated a massive outbound movement of capital from the church account directly into the operating account of Sterling and Hayes Associates. It was labeled as a retainer fee for legal services. But the amount was staggering, $400,000. The puzzle pieces did not just snap together. They violently slammed into place, creating a picture so massive and horrifying that it dwarfed Terrence's pathetic infidelity. This law firm was not just representing Terrence in a divorce. Sarah was not just a naive mistress playing real estate games. Sterling and Hayes Associates was receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from Mama Beatrice's tax-exempt church fund. Terrence was broke. Darius owed the cartel $3 million. The cartel wanted their money. Terrence needed a way to clean the cartel money or pay them back using untraceable assets. Mama Beatrice had a massive unaudited church fund, and this high-end, incredibly powerful law firm was acting as the central laundering node, moving the dirty money under the impenetrable guise of attorney-client privilege. Sarah was not the mastermind. She was just a pawn, sitting on top of a massive criminal conspiracy, and Terrence had stupidly led me right to the epicenter of the entire operation. "Call security." "Sarah," I said, reaching out and gently tapping my manicured fingernail directly onto the wire transfer document sitting on her desk. "Call them right now, because when the FBI raids this office, I want to make sure you are sitting exactly where you are." Sarah's pale blue eyes widened in genuine terror. Her hand hovered over the phone, completely paralyzed. She knew I was not bluffing. I did not wait for her to find her voice. I turned on my heel and walked out of the opulent reception area, leaving her to drown in the realization that her luxurious little life was about to become a federal crime scene. The elevator doors slid shut, severing my connection to Sterling and Hayes. I had the financial motive securely locked away on my hard drive. I had the money laundering connection. But financial crimes take months to prosecute. I needed immediate leverage to keep Terrence cornered, and that meant solidifying the attempted murder charge. For that, I needed physical evidence. The ketamine and industrial laxatives were actively being metabolized by Mama Beatrice's body. If Terrence managed to keep her hidden for another 24 hours, the drugs would completely wash out of her system. It would become a simple case of a woman having a brief psychotic break from stress, weakening the police narrative, and giving Terrence room to maneuver his high-priced lawyers. I got back into my car and opened my laptop. Terrence had turned off his phone, but Mama Beatrice was a creature of absolute habit. She never went anywhere without her gold-plated church tablet, which was linked to her administrative email. I pinged the device's IP address. It took less than 2 minutes for my tracking software to bypass the basic location privacy settings. The signal was not coming from a major hospital or a high-end rehabilitation center. It was broadcasting from a notoriously shady cash-only private clinic located on the industrial outskirts of the city near the old rail yards. It was the kind of place that asked zero questions, catered to unregistered patients, and happily ignored gunshot wounds if the envelope of cash was thick enough. I drove through the gray, rain-slicked streets, the morning traffic slowly building around me. The clinic was a squat concrete building with barred windows and a flickering neon sign that simply read, "Medical Center." I parked a block away, pulled my collar up against the damp chill, and walked through the heavy glass doors. The lobby smelled strongly of bleach and cheap stale tobacco. The receptionist behind the bulletproof glass was asleep. I slipped past the front desk and moved silently down the dim linoleum-tiled hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed aggressively overhead. I checked the room numbers against the internal network I had just breached on my phone. Room 114. As I rounded the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing right outside the closed door of room 114 were Keisha and Darius. Darius was pacing nervously, chewing on his thumbnail, while Keisha leaned against the wall, scrolling through her phone, as if she were waiting for a table at a brunch spot, rather than guarding her actively overdosing mother. They did not see me at first. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders. I was not the terrified woman scrambling on the dining room floor anymore. I marched directly toward them. Keisha looked up, her expression morphing from boredom to absolute shock, and then immediately into a vicious, defensive sneer. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, stepping squarely in front of the door to block my path. "How did you even find us?" "Move out of my way, Keisha," I commanded, my voice echoing coldly in the empty hallway. "I am going in there, and I am instructing the nurse to draw a blood sample from your mother. When the police arrive in 10 minutes, they are going to need a chain of custody for the toxicology report." Darius stopped pacing. He looked terrified, taking a step backward. "Charmaine, please," he stammered. "Do not call the cops here. If the police run my name, the people I owe money to will find out where I am. They will kill me. I looked at him with absolute disgust. You should have thought about that before you tried to smash my head in with a dining room chair. I took another step toward the door. Keisha did not back down. She closed the distance between us, her face flushed with unhinged anger. You are not touching our mother, you arrogant witch. You ruined everything. If you had just eaten the damn food, none of this would be happening. She swung her arm wildly. The slap caught me entirely off guard. Her heavy, ring-clad hand cracked across my left cheek with the force of a whip. My head snapped to the side, a blinding flash of pain exploding across my jaw. The metallic taste of blood flooded my mouth as my teeth bit down on my inner cheek. I slowly turned my head back to look at her. I did not raise my hand to touch my burning face. I just stared at her with a dead, hollow intensity that made her instinctively recoil. You hit me because you are weak, Keisha, I said quietly, the blood staining my teeth. You are all so incredibly weak. Was Sarah your idea too? Did you help Terrence pick out his little blonde mistress while you were smiling in my face at Thanksgiving? Keisha laughed. It was a harsh, ugly sound. Her guilt completely vanished, replaced by the toxic, venomous truth she had been holding back for years. Idea. She spat, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. Sarah was at our family barbecue last summer while you were out of town on a business trip. We all knew about her. We loved her. She actually knows how to act like a supportive woman. She does not sit around acting like she is better than everyone else just because she has a corporate job. Darius looked at the floor, refusing to make eye contact, confirming every single word she said. You thought you were so superior? Keisha continued, her voice rising in hysteria. You thought because you paid the mortgage and bought the groceries that you owned Terrence. You never let us breathe. Every time I asked for a loan, you gave me a lecture about financial responsibility. Every time Darius needed capital for an investment, you ran a background check and humiliated him. You were a warden, Charmaine, not a wife. So you decided to kill me, I summarized, feeling the absolute moral bankruptcy of the people standing before me. You justified my murder because I would not let you leech off my salary. Do not play the victim, Keisha snarled, taking another aggressive step forward. You brought this on yourself. You suffocated him. When Terrence told Mama Beatrice about the insurance policy, she did not even flinch. She prayed on it. Do you hear me? She prayed on it and told Terrence that the Lord works in mysterious ways to provide for his faithful. She gave him her blessing to get rid of you. She said you were a barren, stubborn mule and that Terrence needed to secure the family legacy. We needed that money to save Darius. We needed that money to protect the church. You were just collateral damage. The words hung in the sterile air of the clinic hallway. Mama Beatrice had literally prayed for my death. A woman who stood at a pulpit and collected tithes in the name of God had given her son the spiritual green light to poison his wife for $5 million. It was a level of depravity so profound, it almost defied logic. I spit the blood out of my mouth onto the pristine linoleum floor right at Keisha's feet. Well, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, the Lord did work in mysterious ways tonight. Because your mother just financed a federal racketeering case against her own church, your brother is going to federal prison, and you are going to be completely broke for the rest of your miserable life. I reached into my pocket to pull out my phone, fully intending to call Detective Miller and give him the exact room number of the clinic. But before my fingers could unlock the screen, a heavy door creaked open at the far end of the dim corridor. Slow, measured footsteps echoed against the tile. I looked past Keisha's shoulder. Emerging from the deep shadows near the emergency exit was Terrence. He looked completely unhinged. His expensive suit was torn and stained. His eyes were bloodshot and sunken, darting around with the paranoid energy of a hunted animal. But he was not running. He was walking directly toward me with a chilling, artificial calmness. In his right hand, he held a thick, tightly sealed manila envelope. He stopped a few feet away, looking at the fresh red mark on my face and the blood on my lips. A cruel, satisfied smirk twisted his features. He did not look like a man whose murder plot had just been exposed. He looked like a man who was holding the winning lottery ticket. You just could not leave it alone, could you? Charmaine Terrence said, his voice echoing in the narrow space. You just had to go digging. You always have to be the smartest person in the room. He raised the thick manila envelope, tapping it rhythmically against his leg. You think you have me backed into a corner because of a video recording and a few offshore bank transfers. You think you can just freeze my assets and walk away. He let out a low, dark chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. You want to play hardball, Charmaine? Let us play. Terrence pulled the small metal clasp on the manila envelope and slid out a thick stack of freshly printed documents. He did not hand them to me. He simply held up the first page so I could see the crisp, unmistakable letterhead of my own corporate investigation firm. Below the logo were columns of highly sensitive financial data belonging to one of my biggest clients, a massive multinational logistics company. I stared at the paper, my forensic mind instantly recognizing the proprietary formatting. Those files were strictly confidential. They were heavily encrypted and stored on my secure home server, accessible only through a dual authentication gateway. You see, Charmaine, Terrence began, his voice dripping with arrogant satisfaction. You always thought I was just an idiot playing video games in my home office while you were out saving the corporate world. But my new friends at Sterling and Hayes have access to some very sophisticated digital contractors. While you were sleeping, we mirrored your entire home network. We took everything. He flipped to the second page and held it closer to my face. I looked at the numbers. My blood ran completely cold. The documents had been meticulously doctored. The routing numbers, the authorization signatures, the IP access logs, everything had been manipulated with absolute precision. The forged transaction histories made it look like I had been actively siphoning tens of millions of dollars from my corporate clients into a complex web of offshore shell companies. And right there at the bottom of the page was my social security number listed as the primary beneficiary of those illegal accounts. It is a masterpiece, really. Terrence bragged, his eyes wide with manic energy. A senior forensic accountant embezzling from the very hedge funds she is supposed to be auditing. It is the ultimate betrayal of trust. The media will absolutely devour this story. I kept my face completely blank, but internally I was calculating the catastrophic damage those files could cause. Terrence was entirely right. Even if I eventually hired my own legal team and proved the documents were sophisticated forgeries, the initial fallout would be instantly fatal to my career. If those files reached my CEO, I would be fired immediately to protect the firm's stock price. The Securities and Exchange Commission would launch a massive public investigation. My CPA license would be permanently revoked. I would become radioactive in the financial sector. And that was exactly what the cartel and the corrupt law firm wanted. They wanted to neutralize my credibility. If I went to the police with evidence of their money laundering operation, I would just look like a disgraced, vindictive embezzler trying to deflect blame. It was a brilliant, airtight frame job. Terrence lowered the papers and stepped closer, invading my personal space. The smell of his stale cologne and nervous sweat hit my nose. "Here is how this is going to work," he whispered harshly. "First, you are going to call that idiot, Detective Miller, at the precinct. You are going to tell him that you made a terrible mistake. You will say the video footage was a sick prank you staged because you were jealous of my success. You will drop the attempted murder charges against me and Darius completely." He held up a second finger. "Number 2, the house belongs to Sarah's LLC now. You will not contest the eviction notice. You will walk away from the property, and you will forget about the $250,000 I took from our joint accounts. Consider it an administrative fee for wasting 5 years of my life." I did not blink. I just stared at the ugly, jagged little man he truly was, and the rest I asked softly. Terrence smiled, a cruel, greedy stretching of his lips. "Third, and this is the most important part, you are going to log into your corporate fidelity portal and liquidate your entire retirement portfolio. I know there is over $1 million sitting in your 401k. You are going to sign every last penny of it over to me in the divorce settlement. You will walk away with absolutely nothing." Darius let out a loud, relieved sigh from his position against the wall. Keisha smirked, crossing her arms over her chest, thoroughly enjoying my public execution. They all thought they had finally put me in my place. They thought they had finally broken the arrogant, independent woman who refused to fund their lazy, toxic lifestyles. "You have exactly 24 hours," Terrence stated, tapping the envelope against my chest. "Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, you will meet me at the notary office inside Sterling and Hayes. You will sign the divorce papers, the asset transfers, and the police retraction. If you are 1 minute late, or if I see a single police cruiser anywhere near that building, I press send. I have a dead man's switch tied to these files. If I am arrested or if my heart stops beating, the emails automatically deploy to the FBI White Collar Crime Division, your CEO, and the local news stations. Your life will be completely over." He took a step back, slipping the forged documents back into the manila envelope. "See you tomorrow, Charmaine. Try to get some sleep. You look terrible." Terrence turned around and walked back down the dim hospital corridor, disappearing into the room where his mother was recovering. Darius quickly scurried in after him. Keisha lingered for a second, giving me one final triumphant sneer before pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind her. I stood alone in the quiet, sterile hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed aggressively above my head. The metallic taste of blood was still sharp on my tongue from where Keisha had struck me. I turned around and began the long walk back toward the lobby. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the clinic and stepped out into the desolate parking lot. The freezing morning drizzle immediately soaked into my ruined clothes. The adrenaline that had been keeping me upright for the last 8 hours suddenly completely vanished, leaving behind a crushing, agonizing physical exhaustion. My throat throbbed violently with every breath I took. The sheer weight of the betrayal pressed down on my shoulders like physical lead. I stumbled across the wet asphalt until I reached my car. I grabbed the door handle, but my legs suddenly gave out. I collapsed against the cold metal door, sliding down the side of the vehicle until I hit the wet pavement. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapped my arms around my legs, and began to cry. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a loud, hysterical, gasping sob. I buried my face in my hands, letting my shoulders shake violently. I wailed into the empty parking lot, the sound of my absolute despair echoing off the surrounding concrete walls. I was a broken woman, a woman who had just lost her husband, her home, her life savings, and her entire career in a single night. A pair of bright headlights swept across the parking lot, cutting through the morning gloom. Terrence's black luxury SUV rolled slowly past my position. The vehicle slowed to a crawl right in front of my car. The passenger side window slid down silently. Terrence leaned across the plush leather console, looking down at me huddled on the wet ground. He laughed. It was a loud, victorious, deeply satisfied laugh. He reached out the window, casually flicked a burning cigarette butt onto the wet pavement inches from my shoes, and then slammed his foot on the gas. The SUV engine roared as he sped out of the parking lot, turning onto the main access road and vanishing from sight. I stayed on the ground for exactly 10 more seconds. The moment his red taillights disappeared behind a row of abandoned warehouses, my sobbing stopped entirely. The tears vanished from my eyes. My breathing leveled out instantly, shifting from hysterical gasps into a slow, perfectly measured rhythm. I wiped the dampness from my cheeks, my face going completely terrifyingly cold. It was a flawless performance. I needed Terrence to see me broken. I needed him to report back to Sarah and the cartel that the threat had worked, that the wealthy, arrogant wife had finally been crushed into submission. I needed them to drop their guard and feel perfectly secure in their victory for the next 24 hours. I stood up, brushing the wet gravel from my silk trousers. I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors behind me. I did not turn the engine on. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out my heavily encrypted secondary phone. This was not the device the police had handed back to me. This was my secure line, the one I used exclusively for high-level corporate espionage communication. I did not dial Detective Miller at the local precinct. He was a small-town cop out of his depth. This situation had escalated far beyond local jurisdiction. I scrolled through my encrypted contacts list and selected a direct unlisted number in Washington, D.C. The line rang exactly twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered the call. "Miller speaking. Agent Miller." I said, my voice sharp and completely devoid of any emotion. It is Charmaine. I know it is early, but I need you to assemble your strike team. I have the direct financial link to the Eastern European cartel you have been hunting for the last 3 years. And I am going to hand you their primary money laundering node on a silver platter. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the encrypted line. I could hear the faint sound of a coffee mug being set down on a hard desk somewhere in the capital. When Agent Miller finally spoke, all the sleep was completely gone from his voice. You found the node. We have had undercover agents looking for that financial bridge for 36 months, Charmaine. Are you absolutely certain? Absolutely. I'm looking at the wire transfers right now. I replied, my voice steady and cold. The money is flowing through a high-end family law firm in Atlanta called Sterling and Hayes Associates. They are using a local megachurch as a tax-exempt shield to wash the funds before converting them into offshore crypto wallets. My husband and his brother are the local mules. Do not make a single move, Miller ordered, his tone shifting into full operational command. Do not confront them. I am scrambling the Atlanta field office right now. We will have agents at your location in 20 minutes. No, I countered sharply. If you raid that law firm today, the senior partners will shred the physical evidence and claim they were victims of a rogue receptionist. You will get the foot soldiers, but the cartel money will vanish into the digital ether. I need 24 hours to permanently lock the trap. I am meeting all of them tomorrow night to sign my own divorce and asset forfeiture papers. I am going to weave their entire criminal enterprise into those documents. When I sign on the dotted line, I will legally bind their personal assets to the cartel's money laundering operation. It will give you the federal jurisdiction to freeze and seize every single penny they own simultaneously. Miller exhaled sharply. You are putting yourself in the same room with men who actively tried to murder you last night. They are expecting a broken, defeated woman, I said. And that is exactly what I am going to give them. Have your tactical teams ready to breach on my signal tomorrow night. I ended the call and pulled my car out of the hospital parking lot. I drove to a nondescript corporate hotel near the airport, paid for a room in cash, using the emergency funds I kept hidden in my car's spare tire compartment, and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. I closed the blackout curtains, plunging the room into absolute darkness, save for the blue glow of my dual laptop screens. It was time to play my part. I picked up my standard cell phone, the one Terrence knew I used, and opened our text message thread. My fingers flew across the keyboard, carefully crafting the most pathetic, desperate messages imaginable. I needed to feed his massive, fragile ego. Terrence, please. I am begging you. I cannot go to prison. I will do whatever you want. Just please do not send those forged files to my boss. I waited 2 minutes, letting the silence hang, then sent another. I have nothing left. You took my savings. You took my home. Please, Terrence. Just let me keep my car and $10,000 to start over somewhere else. I am so scared. The response came almost instantly. Terrence was awake, sitting somewhere with Sarah, reading my messages and reveling in his absolute power. You should have thought about that before you tried to play games with my family, Charmaine. You get nothing. You show up tomorrow and sign the 401k over to me, or the FBI gets your client files. Do not text me again until you are in the lobby. I stared at his arrogant reply and smiled. It was the smile of a predator watching a mouse walk willingly into a steel trap. While Terrence was busy showing those text messages to Sarah, Keisha, Darius, and Mama Beatrice, gloating about how he had finally broken the Ice Queen, I was busy orchestrating their financial execution. I turned my attention to the high-resolution monitors illuminating the dark hotel room. I had a lot of work to do and only a few hours to do it. Terrence thought he was brilliant for using a legal loophole to transfer our home's equity to Sarah's limited liability company. He thought he was untouchable because the paperwork had been notarized by a prestigious law firm. But he lacked the fundamental understanding of how federal tax structures actually worked. He had built a house of cards on a foundation of gasoline. I pulled up the digital copies of the asset transfer agreements and the divorce settlement Terrence had emailed me earlier that morning. These were the documents he intended to force me to sign under the threat of blackmail. I opened my proprietary forensic editing software and began to completely rewrite the underlying metadata and the deeply buried legal clauses. I started with Sarah's LLC. Using the wire transfer routing numbers I had memorized from her desk at Sterling and Hayes, I drafted a complex financial addendum. I embedded a clause that legally designated Sarah's LLC as a subsidiary holding company for Mama Beatrice's megachurch. By doing this, the luxury home Sarah had stolen from me was now officially an asset of the church. Next, I turned my attention to Darius. He owed $3 million to the cartel, and Terrence had sent them $250,000 in crypto as a down payment. I traced the digital receipts from Terrence's hidden cloud drive and formally registered that specific cryptocurrency transaction as a charitable donation made on behalf of Mama Beatrice's congregation. The web was becoming tighter, pulling them all into the exact same center. The final piece of the puzzle was the blackmail material. Terrence had threatened to release doctored files to ruin my career. I took the digital signatures from those forged documents and hard-coded them into the primary divorce settlement. I wrote a seemingly standard indemnification clause buried on page 47 in tiny legal print. But it was not an indemnification clause at all. It was a federal consent for comprehensive audit. By forcing me to sign this document, Terrence and his lawyers were unknowingly presenting a legally binding agreement that permitted the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation to conduct an immediate, unrestricted audit of every single entity listed in the paperwork. Sarah's LLC, Terrence's real estate brokerage, Darius's crypto wallets, Mama Beatrice's tax-exempt church fund, Sterling and Hayes Associates. I was tying them all together with an invisible, unbreakable thread of federal tax fraud and international money laundering. They thought I was arriving to sign away my retirement fund. They had absolutely no idea they were forcing me to sign their own collective death warrant. I worked straight through the day and into the following night. I did not eat. I did not sleep. I survived on black coffee and the pure, unadulterated adrenaline of impending vengeance. I meticulously checked every single line of code, every routing number, every legal statute. It had to be flawless. If Sarah's high-priced lawyers actually bothered to read the fine print before Terrence slammed it on the table, the entire operation would collapse. But I knew they would not. They were too arrogant. They believed I was a terrified, broken woman who was too busy crying to read a 50-page legal document. Friday night finally arrived. The weather outside mirrored the violent storm raging in my chest. It was the thunderstorm of the century. Massive, jagged forks of lightning split the black Atlanta sky, followed instantly by deafening cracks of thunder that shook the windows of my hotel room. The rain came down in heavy, aggressive sheets, flooding the city streets and casting an apocalyptic gloom over the downtown skyline. I closed my laptop and packed it away in my briefcase. I walked into the hotel bathroom and turned on the harsh vanity lights. I looked at my reflection. The bruises around my neck had darkened into a deep, ugly purple. I did not bother trying to conceal them with makeup. I wanted Terrence to see them. I wanted him to look at the physical evidence of his violence and feel a false sense of absolute dominance. I stripped off the wrinkled silk trousers I had been wearing for 2 days and reached into the garment bag I had purchased earlier that afternoon. I pulled out a tailored, razor-sharp, double-breasted suit. It was not a subdued corporate black or gray. It was a brilliant, striking blood red. I slipped the suit on, buttoning the jacket with precise, deliberate movements. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe bun. I applied a coat of dark crimson lipstick. I looked nothing like the victim Terrence had left sobbing in the hospital parking lot. I looked like an executioner. I grabbed my briefcase, walked out of the hotel room, and took the elevator down to the lobby. The drive to downtown Atlanta was slow and treacherous, the heavy rain severely limiting visibility. But my hands were completely steady on the steering wheel. I parked in the underground garage beneath the Sterling and Hayes office building. The space was mostly empty, the wealthy lawyers having long since fled the impending storm to return to their gated suburban mansions. I stepped out of my car, the heels of my shoes clicking sharply against the concrete floor. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of ozone from the lightning strikes. I walked toward the private executive elevator. I pressed the call button and watched the digital floor indicator descend. I was about to walk into a room filled with people who had used my love, stolen my money, plotted my murder, and tried to destroy my sanity. They were sitting up there right now, drinking expensive champagne, laughing at my expense, waiting for the poor defenseless wife to hand over her final remaining asset. The heavy metal doors of the elevator slid open with a soft chime. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the 45th floor, and allowed myself one final, genuine smile. It was time for the slaughter. The elevator ascended with a smooth, silent speed that made my stomach drop, but my heart remained perfectly steady. The digital numbers above the door flashed until they locked onto 45. With a soft chime, the brushed steel doors slid open, revealing the cavernous, dimly lit reception area of Sterling and Hayes Associates. The quartz desk where Sarah usually sat was empty. The entire floor was eerily quiet, save for the muffled rhythmic pounding of the torrential rain against the reinforced glass of the skyscraper. The storm was reaching its absolute peak, shaking the massive building just enough to feel a subtle sway beneath my feet. I walked down the long mahogany-paneled corridor, the sharp click of my heels echoing off the Italian marble floors. At the very end of the hallway stood a set of towering double doors leading to the primary executive boardroom. Soft, warm light spilled from beneath the crack, along with the faint, unmistakable sound of laughter. They were celebrating. I reached out, grasped the heavy brass handles, and pushed the doors wide open. The boardroom was spectacular. A massive table carved from a single slab of dark walnut dominated the center of the room. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, dizzying view of the storm-battered Atlanta skyline, lightning flashing violently in the black clouds. But the real spectacle was the collection of human parasites gathered around the expensive wood. They were all there, the entire toxic cast of my nightmare. Terrence sat near the head of the table wearing a brand-new, impeccably tailored navy suit. He looked relaxed, arrogant, and entirely too confident for a man who had tried to commit murder less than 24 hours ago. To his immediate right sat Sarah wearing a designer dress and sipping sparkling water from a crystal glass, acting as if she were the senior managing partner of the firm, rather than a receptionist who slept her way into a stolen house. Across from them sat Darius, drumming his fingers nervously against the table, his eyes darting toward the door when I entered. The fear of the cartel was still etched into his face, but it was currently masked by the greedy anticipation of a massive payout. Next to Darius was Keisha. The moment the doors opened, she immediately grabbed her smartphone, held it up high, and pressed record. A bright, obnoxious flash illuminated her vicious, mocking smile. And sitting at the absolute head of the table, looking fully recovered from her humiliating drug-induced public meltdown, was Mama Beatrice. She wore a pristine white church suit, her hair perfectly styled, her posture rigid with self-righteous authority. She looked at my blood-red suit and the dark, ugly bruises ringed around my neck with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Well," Mama Beatrice announced, her voice booming across the long boardroom, "look what the storm washed in. I told you she would come crawling back once she realized she had nowhere else to go." I stepped fully into the room, letting the heavy doors swing shut behind me, but I did not lock them yet. Not yet. I walked slowly toward the empty chair positioned at the far end of the table opposite Mama Beatrice. I did not say a word. I just let them look at me. I let them see the bruises. I let them see the utter lack of defeat in my posture. Keisha stood up, stepping closer to get a better angle with her phone camera. "Say hello to the camera, Charmaine," she taunted, her voice shrill and grating. "I want all my friends to see what a high-powered corporate executive looks like when she finally gets put in her place. Look at you. No house, no money, no husband. Just a sad, bitter woman who thought she was better than her own family." She shoved the phone closer to my face. I could see the red recording light blinking steadily. I did not flinch or turn my head away. I stared directly into the lens, perfectly content to let her document exactly who was in this room on the night their entire empire collapsed. "Let her be, Keisha." Mama Beatrice commanded, waving her hand dismissively. She is here to face the consequences of her pride. The good book says that a rebellious and contentious wife is like a constant dripping on a rainy day. You have been a constant dripping on this family since the day Terence brought you home, Charmaine. A barren woman with a heart full of greed. But the Lord always removes the wicked from the path of the righteous. You are being cast out just as you deserve. The sheer hypocrisy of a woman who had just used a tax-exempt church fund to launder $400,000 quoting scripture at me was almost breathtaking. But I maintained my flawless blank expression. I pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down, folding my hands neatly on the table. Sarah leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, a sickly sweet smile playing on her lips. I drove by the house this morning, Charmaine. The landscaping looks terrible. I'm going to have the entire front yard ripped out next week. And that pale blue guest room you used as an office, I am turning it into a walk-in closet. Terence says you left a bunch of your cheap clothes in there. I told the movers to just throw them in the dumpster. Hey, you can have the clothes, Sarah, I said, my voice quiet and calm. They never quite fit me anyway. Terence let out a loud, mocking laugh. He stood up, picked up a massive stack of legal documents resting in front of him, and walked toward my end of the table. He slapped the thick pile of paper down directly in front of me. The thud echoed sharply in the large room. These are the divorce papers, the asset forfeiture agreements, and the police retraction forms. Terence stated, his tone dripping with absolute authority. Sarah had one of the senior partners review them this morning. They are ironclad. You waive your right to alimony. You transfer the entire balance of your corporate 401k directly into my primary checking account. You formally acknowledge that the house belongs to Sarah's limited liability company, and you sign a sworn affidavit stating that your accusations against me and Darius were the result of a severe untreated manic episode. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy, expensive silver fountain pen. He did not hand it to me politely. He flicked his wrist and tossed the pen directly at my chest. It bounced off my red lapel and clattered onto the table. "Sign it and go back to being a nobody," he sneered, leaning over me, his hands planted firmly on the table. "If you hesitate, if you try to negotiate, or if you refuse to sign even a single page, I walk out of this room and press send on those files. You will be arrested for corporate embezzlement before the sun comes up. Do you understand me?" The room went completely silent. Keisha stopped laughing, holding her phone steady to capture my humiliation. Darius leaned forward, holding his breath, desperate for the money that would save his life. Mama Beatrice adjusted her glasses, waiting for my ultimate submission. Sarah took a delicate sip of her water, relishing her stolen victory. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to cry. They wanted me to beg for a fraction of my own money back. They were feeding on my perceived destruction. I looked down at the thick stack of papers. The trap was laid out perfectly in front of me. All I had to do was spring it. I did not argue. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I reached out and picked up the silver fountain pen. The cool metal felt heavy and solid in my hand. I uncapped it, flipped to the first page marked with a yellow sticky tab, and smoothly signed my name. Charmaine Hayes. I flipped to the next tab. I signed again. I went through the entire stack page by page, document by document. I signed the transfer of the retirement funds. I signed the police retraction. I signed the real estate concessions. I signed the heavily buried federal consent for comprehensive audit clause that bound every single one of their names, LLCs, and church accounts into a massive web of tax fraud and money laundering. I signed my name with the flawless, sweeping strokes of a woman who knew exactly what she was executing. The only sound in the boardroom was the scratching of the pen against the thick paper and the relentless pounding of the rain against the glass. It took me exactly 3 minutes to sign my entire life away on paper. When I reached the final page, I capped the pen and placed it neatly next to the documents. I pushed the stack back across the polished wood toward Terence. Terence snatched the papers up instantly. He flipped through the signature lines, his eyes scanning rapidly to ensure I had not missed a single one. A massive, genuine smile broke across his face. He let out a loud exhale of pure relief and triumph. "We are done here," Terence announced, turning back toward his family, holding the papers up like a hard-won trophy. "The money will be transferred by Monday morning." "Darius, you are clear. Mama, the church is safe. Sarah, the house is officially ours." Keisha cheered, lowering her phone finally. Mama Beatrice closed her eyes and raised a hand in the air, praising the Lord for delivering her from her evil daughter-in-law. Sarah stood up and wrapped her arms around Terence's neck, kissing him deeply right in front of me. I stood up from my chair. I did not look defeated. I smoothed the front of my blood-red suit, picked up my briefcase, and walked slowly toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the room. "Make sure you drop your keycard at the front desk on your way out," Charmaine Terrence called out from the other end of the table, his voice full of smug dismissal. "And do not ever contact me or my family again." I reached the double doors, but instead of pushing them open and walking out into the dark hallway, I grabbed the heavy brass deadbolt installed on the inside of the frame. I turned it to the right. The heavy metallic clack of the lock sliding into place echoed violently through the room, cutting through their celebration like a gunshot. Terrence stopped laughing. Sarah pulled away from him. Keisha frowned, her phone dropping to her side. Darius stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. "What are you doing?" Terrence demanded, his smug expression instantly replaced by a sharp, defensive confusion. "I said we are done. Unlock the door and get out." I did not unlock the door. I turned around, my back pressed against the heavy wood, effectively sealing the only exit. I looked at the five of them trapped in this luxurious glass box, high above the stormy city. The false facade of the broken, terrified wife vanished entirely, replaced by the cold, calculating predator I truly was. I walked slowly back toward the table, but I did not return to the empty chair. I walked all the way up the side of the long wooden slab until I was standing directly next to Mama Beatrice at the absolute head of the table. I looked down at Terence, who was still clutching the freshly signed documents in his hands. "You should have read the fine print, Terence." Terence scoffed, clutching the stack of papers to his chest, as if his physical grip could alter the ink on the pages. He looked frantically around the room, trying to project strength, trying to rally his family's confidence. But the heavy metallic click of the deadbolt had already planted a deep seed of dread in the air. He tried to laugh it off, a harsh, grating sound. "Read the fine print," he mocked, though his voice cracked noticeably. "These are standard dissolution forms, Charmaine. My lawyers drafted them. You just signed your entire life away. Do not try to play mind games with me now. It is pathetic." I took a slow, measured step toward him, my red heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "Your lawyers drafted the original files, Terence. But you made a fatal error. You sent me the digital copies this morning to review before the notary appointment. You assumed I would be too busy crying in a cheap hotel room to actually read them. But I am a forensic accountant. I do not just read financial documents, I rewrite them. And I spent the last 24 hours rewriting every single page you are currently holding in your hands." Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. "What is she talking about, Terence?" she demanded, her voice shrill and tight with sudden anxiety. "Tell her to unlock the door right now." I turned my gaze to Sarah, pinning her to the spot with a look of absolute chilling contempt. "Let us start with you, Sarah. You were so incredibly proud of your little limited liability company. You thought you found a brilliant airtight legal loophole to steal my home and play house with my husband. But you forgot that an LLC is a corporate entity subject to federal tax structuring. When I signed that property transfer just now, I did not authorize a standard equity release to you. I embedded a deeply hidden metadata clause that legally designated your LLC as a subsidiary holding company for Mama Beatrice's church. By accepting that document, you just merged your stolen real estate portfolio with an active, unaudited money laundering operation. Your name is now permanently tied to a criminal enterprise. You are not a homeowner, Sarah. You are a federal co-conspirator. Sarah's face drained of all color, turning a sickly, translucent white. She looked at Terence, her eyes wide with mounting panic, but Terence was frantically flipping through the pages, desperately searching for the clauses I was describing. The legal jargon was dense, intentionally complex, and completely foreign to a failing real estate agent who relied on deceit rather than intellect. I shifted my attention down the table. Darius was next. He was standing completely rigid, his hands trembling against his sides. "And you, Darius, you owe $3 million to a ruthless Eastern European cartel." Terrence thought he was being so clever by wiring them $250,000 in untraceable cryptocurrency last night. He thought it would buy you time to execute me. But I tracked the digital receipts from Terrence's encrypted cloud drive. In the settlement papers Terrence just accepted and countersigned, I formally registered that specific cryptocurrency transaction as a charitable donation made on behalf of your mother's congregation. I legally bound your cartel debt to the church's tax identification number. You did not just pay off a dangerous bookie Darius. You just documented a massive international wire fraud scheme and submitted it for federal review. Darius let out a strangled, agonizing gasp, stumbling backward until his back hit the cold glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked like he was going to vomit. "You brought the feds into this," he whispered, his voice trembling with sheer, unadulterated terror. "The cartel is going to kill us. They're going to slaughter all of us for exposing their wallets." Terrence slammed the crumpled papers down onto the polished walnut table. "Stop lying," he roared, spit flying from his lips. "You cannot just change legal documents. The notary has to verify the changes. This is a massive bluff. You are just trying to scare us because you know you have lost." I laughed. It was a cold, sharp, metallic sound that echoed off the glass walls. "The notary works for Sterling and Hayes Terrence, the exact same law firm that is currently processing a $400,000 wire transfer from your mother's church account to wash your dirty cartel money. Do you really think a corrupt paralegal is going to meticulously read a 50-page divorce settlement on a Friday night during the hurricane of the century? They just wanted to bill the hours. They stamped it because they looked at my bruised neck and thought I was a broken, terrified victim who would sign anything to escape." I turned my attention to the absolute head of the table. Mama Beatrice was no longer sitting with her rigid, self-righteous posture. She was gripping the armrests of her heavy leather chair, her knuckles bone-white, her breathing shallow and dangerously erratic. Her designer glasses had slipped down the bridge of her nose. "And that brings us to the matriarch," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, commanding register that filled the entire room. "The woman who prayed to the Lord for my death. The woman who gave her son the spiritual blessing to poison my food so she could protect her precious sanctuary and her stolen wealth. Your church is not a house of worship, Mama Beatrice. It is a massive washing machine for dirty money. And I found the exact routing numbers you used to funnel the donations into Terrence's fake real estate brokerage. I found the direct transfers to Sterling and Hayes." Mama Beatrice's mouth opened and closed silently like a fish pulled out of water. Her hypocritical religious armor was completely shattered in an instant, leaving nothing but a terrified, corrupt old woman exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of reality. I pointed a manicured finger directly at her face. "Every single dollar you stole from your faithful congregation, every single tithe you diverted to pay for Keisha's extravagant lifestyle, Darius's gambling debts, and Terrence's pathetic failures, it is all perfectly documented. And the best part is, I did not even have to hack into your bank accounts to prove it to the authorities. Terrence just proved it for me." Keisha dropped her phone onto the table. The video recording had stopped. She was staring at me with a look of absolute paralyzing horror, finally realizing that her entire life of unearned luxury was evaporating right in front of her eyes. "What did you do, Charmaine?" she asked, her voice breaking into a pathetic whisper. "What did you actually sign?" I walked back to my end of the table, resting my hands firmly on the polished walnut wood. I looked Terrence dead in the eye, watching the arrogance completely drain from his soul. "I did not sign over my retirement fund, Terrence. I did not sign a police retraction. I did not sign a non-disclosure agreement. The document you are holding, the one you are so desperately clutching and celebrating over, is a federal consent for comprehensive audit." The words hung in the air, heavy and overwhelmingly lethal. By forcing me to sign those papers, and by countersigning them as the primary beneficiary, you just presented a legally binding agreement that permits the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation to conduct an immediate, unrestricted audit of every single entity listed in the paperwork. You just gave them the legal right to completely bypass the standard judicial warrant process. You just authorized the federal government to freeze your bank accounts, seize your properties, dismantle Sarah's LLC, and audit your mother's entire church fund. You tied all of your criminal activities together with a neat little bow, and you legally invited the feds to come inside and take it all. Terrence stared at the papers on the table. His hands began to shake violently, a tremor he could not control. He reached out and grabbed the document, flipping aggressively to page 47, his eyes darting frantically across the tiny print. He was looking for the indemnification clause his lawyers had promised him. Instead, he was reading the legal equivalent of his own financial suicide note. The crushing reality of what he had done finally crashed over him like a tidal wave. He had not outsmarted me. He had not broken me. He had weaponized his own greed and used it to destroy his entire family. He had handed me the exact tool I needed to execute them all. "You are bluffing," Terrence whispered, his voice completely hollow and devoid of breath. "You are bluffing. There is no way you could have done this. The FBI does not work this fast. They do not care about a domestic dispute. This has not been a domestic dispute since you wired cartel money through a tax-exempt entity." I corrected him, my voice ringing with absolute certainty and power. "The moment you hit send on that crypto transfer last night, you became a national security threat. I called my contacts at the federal level at 5 o'clock this morning. They have been monitoring this building all day. They have been watching your offshore accounts. They have been waiting for you to countersign that specific document to finalize the probable cause." Sarah let out a loud, hysterical sob. She backed away from the table, her hands clutching her perfectly styled blonde hair. "I am not going to prison," she cried out. "I just wanted a house. Terrence told me it was safe. He told me it was perfectly legal." "Shut up, Sarah," Keisha screamed, her own panic completely taking over her rational thought. "This is all your fault. If you had not been sleeping with my brother, none of this would be happening right now." I looked at them, tearing each other apart. The loyalty they claimed to have, the family bond they used to justify my murder, it was all entirely conditional and completely fake. The moment their survival was threatened, they turned on each other like starving animals fighting over scraps. It was pathetic, and it was deeply, profoundly satisfying. Terrence crushed the papers in his hands, crumpling the thick legal documents into a messy, ruined ball. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The suave, arrogant facade melted away completely, revealing the violent, desperate predator underneath. He had lost everything. His money, his mistress, his mother's empire, his freedom. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. "You lying witch!" Terrence roared, his voice tearing violently through his throat. "I will kill you! I will kill you right now!" He vaulted over the heavy wooden table, his expensive navy suit tearing at the seams. He scrambled across the polished walnut, kicking over the crystal water pitchers and scattering Keisha's phone to the floor. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and completely devoid of any remaining sanity. He was lunging directly for my throat, aiming to finish the job he had started on the dining room floor. I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle to retreat. I just stood my ground, my hands resting calmly by my sides, watching him launch his body across the massive boardroom table. Before Terrence's outstretched hands could even come close to my neck, a deafening explosive crash violently shook the entire 45th floor. The massive solid oak double doors of the boardroom did not just open. They were completely blown off their reinforced steel hinges by the sheer devastating force of a tactical battering ram. The splintered wood flew across the polished marble floor like shrapnel. A thick cloud of dust and plaster erupted into the pristine air of the 45th floor boardroom. Through the settling haze, a flood of heavily armored tactical units poured into the room. They wore dark Kevlar vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. There were dozens of them, moving with terrifying, synchronized precision. Terrence, who had been in midair lunging across the walnut table to attack me, completely froze. The primal rage in his eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by a cold, paralyzing dread. He crashed onto the surface of the table, his expensive navy suit sliding awkwardly across the polished wood, knocking over the remaining water glasses. "Do not move a single muscle," a commanding voice boomed over the chaos. 5 bright red laser sights instantly painted Terrence's chest, hovering directly over his heart. He slowly raised his trembling hands into the air, his palms facing outward in a gesture of total surrender. He slid off the table and collapsed onto his knees on the marble floor, the fight completely drained from his body. Federal agents swarmed the perimeter of the room, securing every window and secondary exit. The sheer volume of law enforcement personnel completely dwarfed the 5 people who had just been celebrating my destruction. Agent Miller. The man I had spoken to on the encrypted line that morning stepped through the ruined doorway. He was a tall, imposing man with graying hair and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He wore a dark suit over a tactical vest, his badge shining under the bright boardroom lights. He looked at the shattered doors, then looked at Terrence kneeling on the floor, and finally locked eyes with me. He gave a single respectful nod. "Secure the room," Miller ordered his team. "Nobody touches a single piece of paper on that table. Those documents are federal evidence." That was the exact moment the illusion of their family loyalty completely evaporated. The false bonds of blood and shared greed shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Keisha was the first to break. She backed away from the table, her hands raised high above her head, tears streaming down her face, entirely ruining her expensive makeup. "I did not do anything." Keisha screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. She pointed a shaking finger directly at her brother Darius, who was cowering against the floor-to-ceiling windows. "It was him. Darius is the one who owes the cartel money. He has the offshore crypto wallets on his phone right now. He is the one who forced Terrence to steal the money. I just came here for a family dinner. I swear to God I have nothing to do with this." Darius looked at his sister with sheer, unadulterated horror. "You lying traitor." Darius sobbed, his voice cracking wildly as 2 heavily armed agents grabbed his arms and forced him face down onto the floor. Terrence orchestrated the whole thing from the very beginning. Terrence is the one who paid the cartel with Charmaine's money. Terrence is the one who bought the poison and tried to kill Charmaine last night. Check his phone right now. Check his bank accounts. Check his encrypted drives. I was just following his orders because he promised he would fix the debt. Please, you have to protect me from the cartel. If I go to federal prison, they will have me killed in the yard before the trial even starts." He wailed pathetically as the cold steel handcuffs snapped violently around his wrists. The loud metallic click echoed through the room, a sound of absolute finality. Mama Beatrice did not cry. She did not beg the agents for mercy. Instead, the self-righteous matriarch turned all of her venomous, hypocritical rage onto the son she had previously praised. She lunged forward, her white church suit contrasting sharply against the dark uniforms of the federal agents. She swung her hand and slapped Terrence across the face with a sickening heavy crack. "You stupid, arrogant boy," Mama Beatrice shrieked, spitting the words into his face as he cowered on his knees. "You ruined everything. You ruined my legacy. You ruined my church. You told me the money would be completely untraceable. You told me the lawyers had secured the property. You brought the federal government into my sanctuary. You are a disgrace to this family." Terrence did not fight back. He just stared blankly at the floor, the red lasers still dancing across his chest. Agent Miller stepped forward and grabbed Mama Beatrice by the shoulder, spinning her around and forcing her arms behind her back. "Beatrice Hayes," Miller said, his voice calm and entirely devoid of sympathy. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you start using it." Mama Beatrice gasped indignantly, struggling against his grip, but she was quickly subdued. The click of her handcuffs sounded even louder than Darius's. While the family was busy tearing each other to pieces, Sarah decided to make her final desperate play. She realized the agents were momentarily focused on securing the 3 primary targets. She dropped to her hands and knees, ignoring the expensive fabric of her designer dress. and began crawling frantically toward the small catering door tucked away in the back corner of the boardroom. She thought she knew the layout of the building better than the raid team. She thought she could slip into the service elevator and vanish into the stormy night. She made it exactly 5 feet. A female IRS criminal investigator stepped out from behind a decorative potted plant, completely blocking Sarah's path. Sarah looked up, her blue eyes wide with panic. She scrambled to turn around, but the female agent did not hesitate. She dropped her weight, tackled Sarah hard to the marble floor, and drove a knee squarely into the small of Sarah's back, pinning her securely to the ground. "Get off me!" Sarah shrieked, thrashing wildly against the firm grip. "I am just a receptionist. I do not even know these people. I was just delivering paperwork. You are making a massive mistake. My boss is a senior partner at this firm. He will have your badge for this." The female agent grabbed Sarah's wrist, pulling it behind her back with practiced efficiency. "Your boss is currently in the lobby downstairs being fitted for a matching pair of bracelets," the agent replied coldly. "We intercepted the $400,000 wire transfer your LLC attempted to process 10 minutes ago. You are not a receptionist anymore, Sarah. You are an accessory to international racketeering." The handcuffs snapped around Sarah's wrists, securing the Cartier love bracelet tightly against the cold metal. Sarah buried her face against the cold floor and began to sob uncontrollably, the reality of her ruined life finally crashing down upon her. She had traded her youth and her freedom for a man who could not even protect himself, let alone her. Within 3 minutes, the entire boardroom was completely secured. The 5 people who had dedicated their lives to destroying mine were all sitting or lying on the floor in restraints. The arrogance, the smug superiority, the mocking laughter, it was all entirely gone. They looked small, pathetic, and utterly defeated. Agent Miller walked over to the table and carefully slid the thick stack of signed documents into a clear plastic evidence bag. He sealed the top and handed it to a junior agent. He then turned to me. "Are you injured, Charmaine?" Miller asked quietly, noting the dark bruising around my neck for the first time. "I am perfectly fine, Agent Miller," I replied, my voice steady and clear. "Everything you need to dismantle their entire network is right there in that bag. The offshore accounts, the forged medical records, the church routing numbers. It is all tied together." "You did good work today," Miller said with a rare, genuine smile. "We will need you to come into the field office tomorrow to give a formal recorded statement. But for tonight, you are completely free to go. We have teams securing your house as we speak. The locks will be changed by morning." "Thank you." I nodded respectfully. 2 massive federal agents reached down and hauled Terrence roughly to his feet. His legs barely supported his weight. His tailored suit was covered in dust. His tie was ripped, and his face bore the bright red mark of his mother's hand. As they began to march him toward the ruined doorway, Terrence dug his heels into the marble floor, desperately trying to stop his momentum. He looked wildly around the room until his eyes locked onto me. The sheer naked terror on his face was absolute. "Charmaine," Terrence pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Charmaine, please, you have to tell them to stop. We are husband and wife. We took vows. I was just stressed. I was just trying to protect my brother. Please, I will give you everything back. I will sign the house over to you. I will give you the money. Just tell them you made a mistake. Please, baby, do not let them take me away." He was crying now, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. He was begging the woman he had tried to murder just 24 hours prior to save him from the consequences of his own actions. I stood perfectly still, watching him struggle against the grip of the federal agents. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of remorse. I looked at the man who had traded my life for a payout, and I felt absolutely nothing but the profound, liberating weightlessness of closure. I did not answer him. I did not offer him a single word of comfort or condemnation. He was no longer worth the breath it would take to speak. I slowly reached down and picked up the sleek black umbrella I had leaned against the conference table. I smoothed the lapels of my blood-red suit, ensuring every line was perfectly sharp. I gripped the handle of my briefcase firmly in my left hand. Terrence continued to scream my name, begging and crying as the agents dragged him physically out of the boardroom and into the dimly lit hallway. His desperate pleas echoed down the corridor, mingling with the wails of his mother and the sobs of his mistress. I walked toward the exit. As I reached the doorway, I had to step over the shattered remains of the heavy oak doors lying on the floor. I stepped right over the splintered wood, walking past the armed guards, and stepping into the private executive elevator. I pressed the button for the lobby. The steel doors slid shut completely, cutting off the sound of Terrence's voice forever. I stood alone in the quiet elevator car, watching the digital numbers count down. The silence was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. When I finally stepped out of the skyscraper and onto the downtown Atlanta sidewalk, the worst of the thunderstorm had passed. The heavy, violent rain had softened into a gentle, cleansing drizzle. The cool night air smelled clean and fresh, washed free of the suffocating humidity. I opened my black umbrella, holding it high above my head, and stepped out into the rain. I walked down the wet pavement, my head held high, my future completely my own. I was entirely free. Exactly 1 year later, the heavy rain of that unforgettable night felt like a distant, washed-away memory. I stood quietly in the center of a massive sunlit sanctuary, looking up at the high vaulted ceilings and the stunning stained glass windows. Sunlight poured through the colored glass, painting the polished hardwood floors in brilliant shades of gold and blue. This building used to belong to Mama Beatrice. It was the epicenter of her hypocritical empire, the megachurch where she stood every Sunday in her $2,000 suits, judging her congregation, while secretly siphoning their hard-earned tithes to fund her family's criminal lifestyle. Today, it belongs entirely to me. When the federal government seized all of the Hayes family assets, this massive property went into immediate foreclosure. Because the church's tax-exempt status was completely revoked due to the money laundering convictions, the commercial value plummeted. I attended the government auction 3 months ago and bought the entire estate for absolute pennies on the dollar using the money I had legally protected. But I did not buy it to preach. I bought it to rebuild. I spent the last few months completely transforming the space. The grand pulpit where Mama Beatrice used to demand blind obedience has been removed. In its place sits a state-of-the-art financial literacy and legal aid center specifically designed for minority women facing domestic and economic abuse. Where there used to be collection plates passing off stolen money to cartels, there are now free seminars on credit repair, asset protection, and forensic accounting. Women who have had their bank accounts drained by toxic partners, women who have been manipulated by predatory family members, they come here to learn how to fight back. We give them the tools to reclaim their independence, secure their financial futures, and build their own empires from scratch. The people who tried to destroy me did not fare quite so well in their new lives. Terrence's high-priced lawyers from Sterling and Hayes could not save him, mostly because the senior partners of that firm were too busy desperately trying to negotiate their own federal plea deals to avoid serving time alongside their clients. Without their protection, Terrence's case completely collapsed. Between my hidden camera footage, the forged psychiatric records, and the detailed money laundering trails he so arrogantly documented, the judge showed absolutely no mercy. Terrence was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He was convicted of first-degree attempted murder, massive wire fraud, and federal racketeering. The man who cared so deeply about his expensive tailored suits and luxury cars now wears a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, spending 23 hours a day in a concrete cell. He sends me letters sometimes, begging for forgiveness, crying about how hard his life has become behind bars. I never open them. I just throw them directly into the shredder. Darius received a slightly lighter sentence for cooperating with the federal prosecutors, but he is still serving 15 years in federal prison. The cartel he owed $3 million to was completely dismantled by the FBI, using the digital roadmaps I handed over that night. The dangerous men who were threatening to break his bones are now his cellmates, which means Darius spends every single day looking over his shoulder in absolute terror. Keisha and Sarah lost absolutely everything. The limited liability company Sarah used to steal my house was immediately seized and liquidated by the IRS. She lost her job, her fancy apartment, and her law firm connections. Keisha was forced to move out of her luxury condo and now works 2 minimum-wage retail jobs just to afford a tiny studio apartment in the worst part of town. But the greatest, most profound justice was reserved for Mama Beatrice, the arrogant matriarch who built her entire identity around her holy superiority, and her prestigious community status lost it all in a matter of hours. The megachurch congregation abandoned her the moment the embezzlement scandal hit the local news. She was publicly disgraced, her reputation completely ruined. Today, Mama Beatrice does not wear custom pink suits or designer glasses. She wears a polyester uniform and a headset. I drove through a local fast food drive-thru last week on my way to the office, and the voice taking my order sounded incredibly familiar. When I pulled up to the window, there she was. Mama Beatrice, stripped of her pride, her stolen wealth, and her dignity, handing over greasy paper bags for $14 an hour. She looked at me sitting in the driver's seat of my new car, her eyes widening in sheer humiliation. She tried to hide her face, turning away quickly, but the damage was already done. She had to swallow her pride and hand me my receipt. I gave her a $20 tip, smiled warmly, and drove away without saying a single word. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that surviving that toxic family was the greatest test of my entire life. They tried to use my own success against me. They weaponized my loyalty and tried to extinguish my light simply because I refused to be their endless source of funding. But the fire they tried to throw me into only forged me into something infinitely stronger. I step up to the camera now, looking directly at all of you who have followed this journey to the very end. They thought they could throw me away because I didn't fit their toxic mold. They dug a grave for me, but they forgot I owned the shovel. If you've ever had to burn down a toxic family tree to plant your own roots, drop a 100 in the comments. Like, subscribe, and remember, never let anyone tell you your worth, especially not the people trying to steal it.